Chapter 474. No one was willing to let such a process happen again, so Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to go in, regardless of whether he was willing or not. Barriers were a very important direction in the Dharma Meridian orthodoxy. According to their functions, there were three types: combat, support, and special. According to the way they were used, there were also two types: Tao realm and self-generated realm. The self-generated boundary required cultivators to spend a long time in this field. Just like the blood river boundary of the blood river, the cultivators of the blood river would spend their entire lives there. All their abilities, whether it was cultivation or fighting, were related to the blood river. However, the orthodox Taoist cultivators obviously could not do this, because there were too many wonderful spells that they could learn. There was no need to tie themselves to a boundary, which was both meaningless and inefficient. Furthermore, in the foundation establishment stage, the power of a cultivator's barrier was also very limited, far from the realm where they were both the realm and the realm was them. To maintain a huge barrier, they needed to continuously output mana and spirit. The gains did not make up for the losses. This point could be seen from the fact that the Blood River cultivator Yapu had cultivated the Blood River realm all his life, and its true power was very limited. This awkwardness would be greatly improved in the Jindan, and it would truly become a powerful realm that could control life and death. Therefore, the barriers of the Dharma Meridian were mostly support. Don't underestimate the support. If used properly in battle, the support could be more deadly than a purely active battle barrier. Shoryu's Four Corners realm was such a barrier. It was a special type of support barrier formed by an external object, the Four Corners Pagoda. In this realm, the environment inside the realm treated both parties equally. Shoryu could even take in this realm, but he could not control it. It sounded very limited, but it was precisely because of this limitation that the Four Corners realm's support ability was abnormally strong. Shoryu did not need to exert himself to control it, and could focus all of his energy on his own attack and defense. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi enter the barrier, Shoryu once again clasped his hands in a very polite manner. This realm is called the Four Corners realm, and its restriction is very powerful. It is one of the most powerful barriers in the Three Pure One's secret treasury. However, there is one thing: whether it is you or me, the restriction of this realm is the same. Therefore, I am not taking advantage of you too much, right? Fellow Daoist Yang's swordsmanship is too shocking and unpredictable. It's hard to resist. I hope you can forgive me for coming up with this plan. Lu Xiaoyi was a little speechless. He was most annoyed by these people who appeared to be polite on the surface but were secretly scheming. If they wanted to fight, then so be it. But they always had to put themselves on a pedestal in terms of righteousness. Since the Daoist pretended to be polite, he didn't mind asking a few questions. I've long heard of the profound Taoism of the three purities and exquisite artifacts. I wonder what's so special about this square pagoda. Shoryu didn't hide it at all. Before he came to Yue, when the elders took him to see the downgrade spiritual weapons in the secret warehouse, he took a fancy to this square tower at first glance. This was because the function of the pagoda was very much to his liking. It was also upright and would help to establish the image of a virtuous person. There's nothing that can't be told. This pagoda has two flaws. The first was to isolate the perception of the stars. Secondly, there is a fixed time limit of 3 quarters. Anyone who enters the pagoda will not be exempted. If the time is not up, neither of us will be able to leave. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. It seems that the fact that I cultivate stars is a secret that everyone knows. Neither of us can leave. Fellow Daoist, won't you be able to leave after putting away the pagoda? Therefore, it's only restricting me. This Dharma cultivator was really a calculative person. He seemed to be telling the truth, but in fact, he would naturally feel what he said next. Under the open and above board, it was a kind of psychological influence. Unknowingly, it seemed that the situation had begun to deviate from the Dharma cultivator's side. This was the impression that he wanted to create, to make him make mistakes in his anxiety. Shoryu smiled but didn't say anything. Of course, there had to be a target when using external objects. Otherwise, why would he use the square pagoda in this kind of situation? The foundation of a sect was also a part of a cultivator's strength. For example, Shenyuan. Even if they wanted to target a certain Dharma cultivator, what good things could they find in the treasury? Besides the sword, what else did they have? This was why the Dharma vein thought that it was stronger than the sword vein. The sword vein would never be able to catch up with their foundation. The records were very clear. This person's main cultivation technique was the Big Dipper star scripture. His escape technique was the starlight traction. His body technique was the purple star body. All of them were closely related to the stars. To put it bluntly, the square pagoda barrier was actually a star pagoda barrier. Of course, it couldn't completely pagoda, but if it could cover 70% or 80%, what chance did the swordsman have? The effects of the Big Dipper star scripture were greatly reduced. During battle, the circulation and replenishment of mana would be limited. He could only rely on the mana in his body to resist. Most importantly, the swordsman lost his speed and couldn't move freely. He could only exchange blows with him and lose most of his flexibility. As for the exchange of blows, he had his own trump card. The square pagoda barrier was a translucent space to the spectators. Vaguely, in the eyes of the spectators, it was like two graceful figures being courteous before performing their magic. Then, they attacked at the same time. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have anything new. The Four Seasons, Ju City, and Hidden Fragrance all came out. He wanted to see what abilities this Shuru had that he dared to exchange blows with him in this small square pagoda barrier. Previously, Monk Bright Lantern used strange techniques to counter, but he didn't have the courage to meet Shuru head-on. Shuru smiled and pulled on his belt. Instantly, dozens of top-grade magic tools flew out at the same time. 7 or 8 of them revolved around him, forming a defensive formation. 5 or 6 offensive magic tools went straight for Lu Xiaoyi. This was the fastest and most powerful cultivator that Lu Xiaoyi had ever seen in a battle. Not only did he need to be skilled in controlling them, he also needed to be rich. This wasn't something an ordinary cultivator could afford. The secret was on that belt. It should be the key to activating it in one go. But to Lu Xiaoyi, this wasn't important. Because this was a good opponent. His attack and defense were balanced. He wasn't afraid of his heavy sword, but brazenly attacked. His attitude was completely different from his previous polite attitude. Lu Xiaoyi's figure leapt. Under the pull of the stars, he was already flying. The Big Dipper circled around him, dealing with the attacks of his opponent's magic tools. But his own attacks didn't slow down at all. This was the foundation of his siege. Shuru sighed in his heart. As expected, the square pagoda barrier's restrictions on the stars didn't have any effect on this person. There were many reasons, but it wasn't appropriate to delve into it now. But the most important part of the square pagoda barrier he chose was already ineffective. He saw very clearly that his opponent was completely using the celestial barrier. He wasn't affected in the slightest. Lu Xiaoyi's 3 flying swords connected into a line, attacking from the tail. This was the swordsman's most classic attack pattern. It was also the simplest, and in most cases, the most effective. Among the 8 defensive magic tools, the Four Seasons broke through 3, the Ju City broke through 4, and the final Hidden Fragrance directly hit Shuru's body after sweeping away the last magic tool. A burst of white light flashed, and Shuru was safe and sound. This top-grade magic cultivator who was full of righteousness and full of Dao heart actually also had an external attack. Chapter 475. Lu Xiaoyi did not have an easy time dodging the attacks. Even with the help of the Big Dipper flying sword and his high-speed movements, it was unavoidable for him to be hit by the attacks of 5 offensive magic tools at the same time. No matter what, the size of the 4 directions barrier was still a little frustrating for the swordsman. The 2 characteristics of the 4 square worlds that Shuru had mentioned were actually of little significance to him. After his star system had been refined once more in the peacock plume, the stars that his opponent used to obscure the main world could no longer affect him, unless they were concealing the main world and the anti-world at the same time, not to mention a foundation establishment cultivator. Even a demigod or immortal equipment would not be able to do such a thing. Could the void of the universe be isolated by humans? With such a fatal weakness, How could the star system become one of the top cultivation methods in the world? However, the four directions barrier had a very common characteristic that greatly restricted him. That was, the space within the four directions barrier was relatively narrow. Even if his star escape technique was not affected, he would not be able to display the full power of his sword. He would also not be able to display his long-range advantage. In this place, he only had a mid-range advantage. Because he was worried about the existence of something similar to the chaos clock, he did not dare to casually use close-range techniques. From the looks of it, Lu Xiaoyi was in a more difficult situation, but Shuru had already died for him once. However, Shuru knew that he did not have much time left. In his original plan, if his opponent's star system was restricted, he could try to drag the battle out as long as possible and magnify the effect of the four directions barrier. However, this plan was no longer feasible, and he could not guarantee that his opponent would fall before him. Although the swordsman was in a difficult situation right now, the problem was that his external talisman had a limit. It was not that it was not enough, but that it had a fixed maximum number of uses in a day. It could not be used infinitely. There was no such heaven-defying thing in the cultivation world. He needed to unleash a wave of attacks before the limit of the external talisman ran out. Then, he would decide whether to stay or leave. Idiots would only rely on the death substitution talisman to take risks, but smart people would know how to control the risks within a controllable reign. The death substitution talisman was not a question of whether to use it or not, but how to use it. Shuru had plenty of experience in this aspect. In a battle, Shuru's adaptability wasn't inferior to the swordsman's. He didn't hesitate at all. He pulled out his belt again and another 8 magic treasures appeared. At the same time, the 8 defensive magic treasures returned to his waist. The belt itself was also a magic treasure. It had no other use but to activate magic treasures. It was very useful in battle. Others would need a few breaths of time to activate several magic treasures, but he only needed an instant. Just this point alone was enough to make many powerful cultivators die on the spot. His so-called outburst was actually very simple. A truly brilliant battle tactic was actually very simple. The key was to choose the right timing. Since he had the protection of the external puppet, there was no need for him to draw legs on a snake and use defensive magical tools to defend himself. He could focus all his energy on attacking in a short period of time. Of course, time was extremely limited. Without any defense, he had to suffer the attacks of the 3 flying swords once every breath of time. Using the death substitution talisman 3 times every breath of time, he could only last for 5 breaths of time under such extreme circumstances. Victory or defeat would be decided within 5 breaths. Magic cultivators didn't lack the ability to outburst. Lu Xiaoyi's reaction was very fast. He instantly understood his opponent's intention. This was almost a scoundrel's way of fighting. But who asked him to not be as rich as the other party? He had to endure the attacks of 13 offensive magic treasures at the same time. In the narrow space around him, there was almost no room for him to maneuver. The efficiency of his escape technique was greatly reduced. He could just change to another place and stay away. But he couldn't do that here. One Big Dipper couldn't block it. He could only let the fastest 4 seasons sword come to his aid and release the last luck cutter. This way, under the protection of the 3 flying swords, he could use extreme escape technique to dodge the attacks and take the initiative to endure the damage that wasn't too serious. Only then could he preserve his life. But the disadvantage was that the duration of Shuru's substitute had increased to 7 breaths. In battle, there were always constant changes in the balance. An excellent swordsman couldn't be stubborn. He had to find the most suitable balance for himself. In this kind of battle, Shuru had successfully suppressed Lu Xiaoyi's area of expertise. Ranged attacks were meaningless. Heavy swords were meaningless. Although Shuru had various tricks up his sleeves, there was no doubt that his tactics were successful. But it was very difficult to replicate, because no one had the abnormal ability to produce magic treasures in an instant like him. Also, no one had so many external weapons like him. For a moment, the 2 sides were competing between injuries and death. The cultivators below all broke out in cold sweat. After 7 years of depression, they finally saw a glimmer of hope for victory, even if it was earned through the death substitution talisman. Shuru didn't hold back at all. He knew that if he added 1 or 2 more magic treasures, he would be able to break through the defensive circle of the flying swords. But a cultivator's magic power and spirit determined that there was a limit to any tactic. His limit was 13 magic treasures. If he added 1 more, he would have to rely on weakening the control of the other magic treasures. The gains didn't make up for the losses, but he still had one last trick up his sleeve. One of the magic treasures saw an opportunity and suddenly spewed out an extremely thick blood-red liquid. This wasn't a magic treasure he was familiar with. The sacrificial refining time was also short. The use of the filthy flying swords was secondary. That required enough time. He chose to use it to target the swordsman's possible weakness of blood fainting. This weakness was mentioned in the letter, and it was also confirmed by Yapu of the Red Sun sect. As long as the swordsman lost his mind in front of the blood, he would immediately fall into a dead end. The isolation of the stars, the time limit, and the space limit. The death substitution talisman only allowed him to attack without defending. And now, with the blood fainting, Shuru had used almost all of his strongest moves and compressed them into a few short breaths. No one else could have done more than him, but to his disappointment, his opponent acted as if he didn't see the blood-red liquid. 3 breaths of time had passed. At this moment, Shuru once again displayed the decisiveness and foresight of a disciple of a large sect. He wouldn't be like those idiots who persisted until the end and bet on an uncertain outcome. He uttered a difficult incantation, and the 4-sided pagoda exploded. An inexplicable surge of energy pushed the 2 of them away. The barrier disappeared. Shuru, who had been prepared for this, was handsome like jade. His clothes were white like snow, and his hair was silky like silk. He elegantly moved away from the top of the cliff and politely bowed. "Fellow Daoist Yang, I can't block the sharpness of your flying sword. Naturally, I admit defeat and bid you farewell." On the other hand, Lu Xiaoyi, the victor, looked like a refugee fleeing from disaster. His clothes were ragged, his hair was unkempt, and his face was dirty. His entire body was covered in bruises. It was obvious that he was tortured by the power of the spell. He wasn't angry, nor did he curse. He only bowed back solemnly. He didn't feel disappointed at all. This was a real opponent. Even if it was very sinister, even if it was very cunning, even if it was very scheming, to be able to force Lu Xiaoyi to this extent and suppress him to this extent, this was true ability. Fighting with such an opponent was 10 times or even 100 times better than fighting with those so-called brave warriors. Chapter 476. Once the results were out, the spectators were in an uproar. A spell cultivator scolded, "Didn't using the death substitution talisman affect one's Dao heart? His junior brother Yu Jiyu only used 3 talismans, and now it's his turn to end it. Did any of you count? How many talismans did he use? More than 10? Or more than 10? These people were originally prepared to challenge the swordsman, but were later eliminated. They knew the truth, but most of the people under the fish leap did not know. They felt that they had already seen the dawn of victory, and as long as they put in a little more effort, they would definitely be able to take down the swordsman. From being easily defeated at the start, to being able to escape with his life, to attacking and defending, to finally being able to retreat gracefully, to being able to injure the swordsman all over, leaving him in a sorry state. Following that, if a few more people went up, their goal of sniping the swordsman would be achieved, right? However, the following situation was completely out of the expectations of these hot-blooded spell cultivators. On the second day after the battle, not a single spell cultivator went up to challenge the swordsman. Not a single one. Wasn't it better to chase after the cornered enemy? Wasn't it better to strike while the iron was hot and finish it in one go? This was the most basic principle in the cultivation world, a principle that even mortals understood. Why were they acting dumb at this time? The strangeness continued. On the 3rd day, none of the famous top-notch cultivators went up to challenge the swordsman. Wasn't this giving up the opportunity to rest for no reason? Some cultivators could not hold it in any longer, and everyone sought the help of a well-connected cultivator. He knew a few of the experts and had some friendship with them. This person tried his best, and perhaps he had some doubts in his heart. After hitting a wall a few times, he finally met an old cultivator who was easy to talk to. The old cultivator sighed, "All of you are still young. It's a good thing to be young, but you have to look at the situation. Have you ever hunted? Do you know which two situations are the scariest in the process of hunting? The first is when you have cubs. The second is when you are injured. This swordsman is an injured one, and it's a light injury at that. You have a stomach full of anger and have nowhere to vent it. Do you want to go up and face his anger now? Originally, it was a 50-50th outcome, but now it's a 90% chance of death. The three pure ones have a huge pile of external possessions. Does anyone else have that? If I do, I'll go up. Who gave it to me?" He glanced at his friend who could not be considered a friend. "You guys are just here to watch the show. Don't just fan the flames." What everyone sought was immortality, not eternal slumber. Since so many top-notch 5-ring foundation establishment cultivators were unwilling to go up, there had to be a reason for that. Let me tell you the truth. Now, no one is willing to form an organization to intercept us. There will be very few battles. Those who go up are basically people like the three pure ones. It's purely individual behavior. Moreover, it would be very difficult to fight to the death again. Future battles would basically be the same as the final battle of the Supreme Three Clarities Temple. Try first, and if you feel that something is wrong, retreat. Hihi, if there were still people who were hot-blooded enough to fight to the death, then they were destined to not be able to walk on this path for long. Wouldn't it be safer to learn from the big sects? Laughing like the Maitreya Buddha, defy, and talking about the Tao heart with you. In the end, they will be the ones to survive. Don't encourage others to charge up anymore. In the past, it could have been a joke, but now it's pushing people into the fire pit. It's easy to open your mouth, but people will bear grudges in their heart. No one will hate that swordsman. Killing one is killing 10,000 is slaughtering. Instead, people will talk about it with relish. They will be pleased to know this person and be present at the scene, but they will still hate those who push people into the pit, those who lie, those who say one thing but don't do it, and those who say one thing but do another. Lu Xiaoyi closed his eyes and focused on the cliff top. Everything around him was under his control. He realized that it was quite comfortable to be rubbed against the ground once in a while. This was a different feeling, and it taught him more. He knew that this day would come sooner or later. It was better to come early than late. This time, he could still preserve his life. If he delayed any longer, it might be too late by the time he realized what was going on. In the cultivation world, there was no such thing as being invincible forever. Just like his long-range attacks and his heavy sword, when others were familiar with his fighting style, those with wisdom and foundation would definitely be able to find a way to restrain him. Just like this shuru, he had almost succeeded. His long-range attacks were meaningless inside the barrier. Then, were there other ways to restrict long-range attacks besides the barrier? His heavy sword lost its power in front of the death substitution talisman. Then, besides the death substitution talisman, were there other things that could ignore his attacks for a certain period of time? His tactical adaptability was incomparably sharp, but when the opponent didn't compete with him in terms of adaptability, but in terms of the simplest and most fundamental strength, his adaptability was incomparable. Instead, he lost the balance between attack and defense. His defense was a big problem. A swordsman always had to attack. This was a false proposition. Attack and defense were two sides of the same coin in a battle. It depended on the occasion, the situation, and the environment. For example, in the four-sided barrier, if he could achieve a perfect defense, he only needed a flying sword to attack. The problem was that his defense couldn't be flawless. After the attack closed in, he had damage reduction, being with the stars, and the purple star body. But what about before? His 3 flying swords couldn't defend against all of Shuru's attacks. He knew that even if he used 4 flying swords, he wouldn't be able to defend. This came from the diversity and range of spells. It wasn't like 13 arrows that could be blocked head-on. How could a single flying sword block a sea of fire? This was the contradiction between a spear and a shield. Spells came from all over the sky. They weren't fatal, but they were difficult to completely defend against. Flying swords pierced through the air. They were fatal, but easy to block. Using spells to defend against flying swords and using flying swords to defend against spells were both inappropriate and unequal. This was also a problem of system. Although he had a natural intuition about swords, intuition couldn't replace a system, especially the wisdom of countless swordsmen in the sword vein for tens of thousands of years. An individual's strength was limited, but the collective had infinite possibilities. He decided to go back to the dome after completing the fish leap sword thrust and find a few familiar elders to ask. This wasn't shameful. What was shameful was pretending to know when he didn't know. He liked opponents who could make him feel like he was improving, even if it was accompanied by greater danger. This was something he could feel. There were also things he couldn't feel that were subtly influencing him. For example, his desire for dangerous battles was growing. He was slowly transforming into a real swordsman. Shuru was third on the 5-ring foundation establishment ranking. Above him was the second, Wushang burning firewood, and the first, Gord of the Spirit Gord Cave. It was a strange name. It was said that Gord wasn't the root of humans. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. Could this guy be a Gord brother? He was looking forward to it. It was harder for plants to become spirits than animals to become demons, and most of the directions were subsidized. But if there was one who could fight, it would definitely be very strong. Chapter 477. Lu Xiaoyi pondered over his gains and losses at the top of the cliff and drew valuable experience from it. His growth began to lean towards the direction of the state of mind. This was a very rare improvement. It was also a process that every cultivator who wanted to take another step forward had to go through. There were different paths, but he chose the path of inserting the sword. He inserted the sword because he wanted to fulfill his promise to senior brother Guangbei. To be honest, he didn't think too much about it. He didn't come into contact with a true top-notch cultivator of the 5 Rings Foundation establishment stage, nor did he have a long-term plan for his future. He only had confidence in his 50 years of progress in the peacock plume space. Now it seemed that he was a little arrogant at that time. If a cultivator of Shuru's level had attacked him within the first 3 years of inserting the sword, he would have lost more than he would have won. However, in these 7 years of fighting, he had grown rapidly. His growth was not in terms of how fast his sword had become or how much heavier it had become. His growth was in terms of something that could not be seen. It was the clarity of his heart of the sword. From an assassin-type swordsman who was best at sneak attacks, he had become a true swordsman who was more willing to fight fair and square with others. Those who were good at fighting had no illustrious achievement. Those who were less cunning could turn the tables. This was a kind of demeanor. It wasn't for the sake of pretending to be strong, but because this kind of battle was the most common battle in the cultivation world. How could there be so many tables for you to turn? How could there be such a foolish person for you to sneak attack? A sword wasn't a dagger, a swordsman wasn't an assassin. Lu Xiaoyi's mental journey at the top of Fish Leaping Peak was the most important foundation for his future swordsmanship system. In terms of importance, it wasn't any less important than the birth of a sword spirit. But the birth of a sword spirit was still uncontrollable. It was the same for his spirit. He still had a long way to go, but he had finally taken the first step. He once heard from the elder Jin Dan of Thousand Xiu Peak that the highest level of swordsmanship was the sword disciple. He didn't quite understand. Wasn't it the other way around? According to this logic, could it be that his current level of swordsman was that of a sword immortal? It was very strange. Outside Wolf Ridge, a daoist was riding on lightning. In the cultivation world, there were many ways to control the wind, ride the clouds, control objects, transform into light, and so on. However, there were only a few of them, and Imperial Thunder was definitely one of them. Its momentum was extremely shocking. In the space he passed through, there was a long and dense sound of thunder. This was the unique property of the lightning escape. Apart from the fact that the sound was a little loud and couldn't be concealed, everything else was fine. In terms of speed alone, the lightning escape technique wasn't considered one of the top escape techniques in the cultivation world, as there were plenty of escape techniques that were faster than it. The lightning escape technique's uniqueness lay in its innate lightning attribute, which allowed it to repel all evils and disregard all filth. If a Blood River Path cultivator like Yapu encountered someone who used lightning techniques, they would be countered in all aspects. In the end, most Daoist cultivators would not choose the thunder escape technique, unless it was an orthodoxy that focused on thunder like the Tai Heavenly Sect. The choice of escape technique had to follow the main cultivation technique. This was the core principle. He was Zhendanzi, who came from the Tai Heavenly Sect in the southeast region. He was an orthodox Daoist, but his path was more inclined towards the power of thunder. It was an orthodoxy that took the extreme path of thunder and killing in Taoism's neutral, righteous, and peaceful path. It had a very important position in the Daoist lineage. When someone stabbed him with a sword, he immediately knew. Then, he sneered and focused on his cultivation as if it had nothing to do with him. Then, 8 years later, when he walked out of his cultivation place and heard that the person who stabbed him with the sword was still showing off at the fish-leaping cliff, he didn't say anything and directly embarked on his journey. This was the attitude of a true cultivator. He didn't involve himself in other things and did what he should do. He left the rest to the will of heaven. Among the top 10 cultivators in the 5-ring ranking list, most of them were like this. This was also the reality of the cultivation world. There were those who indulged in the affairs of the mortal world, but there were also those who were focused on the path of Tao. They didn't have any other thoughts. They just wanted to meet Gao Xian. In the 5-ring ranking list, in terms of attacking power, there was a saying of East Thunder and West Sword. The West Sword referred to Shenyuan in the western region, while the East Thunder referred to the Tai Heavenly Sect in the southeast region. This saying had been around for a long time. In fact, before they attacked the 5-ring ranking list, there was a saying of South Thunder and North Sword in their old nest, Ju Qingkong, and it had continued until now. Saying was saying. After tens of thousands of years, those who played with thunder also knew that they couldn't beat those who played with swords. Like a curse, Tai had always been on the right path. There were fewer twists and turns and fewer people who could really stir up the universe. They recognized this point. But what made people in the Tai Heavenly Sect curious was that this time, the one who stood out in Shenyuan was a swordsman. This was completely different from their understanding of Shenyuan for tens of thousands of years. 90% of Xuanyuan's glory belonged to the inner sword. When had the outer sword appeared? In a slightly formal occasion, when people talked about Xuanyuan's swordsman, they all referred to the inner sword. What was the outer sword? It was just a maggot that clung to the wings. Zhendanzi wanted to see what was going on, so he came. He didn't even think about the requirement that every cultivator in the top 10 of the 5-ring ranking list had the obligation to challenge the swordsman. He thought about it and was interested, so he came. If he didn't want to come and felt that it was meaningless, then he didn't come. As for whether he was on the ranking list or not, he never cared. Did the Tai Heavenly Sect's foundation establishment senior brother need to run around for such an empty reputation? The thunder rolled over, going deep into the Wolf Ridge and leaping over the Pingtian Plateau. In Lu Xiaoyi's ears, it was like a secretly modified flying car that exploded in the middle of the night in his previous life. Tai Zhendanzi, since you dare to show off your power, take my thunder. Thunder was another attack that had a longer attack range than Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword. Thousands of feet away, a blue thunder as thick as a wrist suddenly struck down, giving him almost no time to react. This was the specialty of lightning elementalists. They gathered lightning in the clouds, accumulated power in the clouds, and then struck down. With a thundercloud as an intermediary, the distance was naturally shortened by half. This was the natural advantage of lightning elementalist. Lu Xiaoyi was already prepared. When he heard the sound of thunder approaching, he was already on guard. Yang Qiong had already told him that the 5th cultivator was a thunder cultivator from Tai Heavenly Sect. In the Bo Pavilion on Qianxiu Peak, there were explanations about the orthodoxies of the 5-ring sect, and even some powerful orthodoxies in the extraterritorial domain. These were the personal combat experiences of the senior swordsman, and also the real foundation of an ancient sect. It was something that an individual could never fully understand by himself. After all, Lu Xiaoyi's time in the dome was limited. It was impossible for him to fully understand the orthodoxies of other sects. Therefore, he only understood some of the orthodoxies that were most specific to Shenyuan, or the ones that were most unique. The Tao of Thunder was the most unique one, so he had put in some effort. Against a thunder cultivator, there were 3 strategies: top, middle, and bottom. The bottom strategy was to use the flying sword to guide the thunder. However, to be honest, this was a delicate task. It was like threading a needle at high altitude at high speed. If it was not aligned properly, it would be disastrous. The middle strategy was to disrupt the thunder cloud's accumulation. Fundamentally, the thunder could not be released. However, this required an incomparably deep understanding of thunder accumulation. Only then could one destroy the thunder in an instant. This was not something that he, who had just come into contact with thunder for the first time, could do. The top strategy was to directly attack the thunder cultivator. In fact, this was also the swordsman's only strategy against any orthodoxies. Chapter 478. Of the 3 strategies, Lu Xiaoyi would obviously choose the best one. This was also his usual fighting style. If he didn't attack the opponent's body, he couldn't just let the lightning strike him. Therefore, the only way to escape was to chase in a straight line. He didn't need to move around. The lightning strikes were faster than lightning. How could he dodge it? However, in the process of chasing, he still had to deal with the lightning above his head. Other than flying swords, he didn't have a better way. If it was a magic cultivator, there were countless ways to counter it. For example, earth elemental spells, magic tools to attract lightning, etc. The swordsman only had one method. A few flying swords were almost all he had in his arsenal. Facing the first lightning strike, he chose the 4 Seasons sword to face it. The 4 Seasons sword spirit was the fastest and most agile. Most importantly, the 4 Seasons sword spirit was the strongest and most resistant to lightning. The lightning swords collided with each other less than 100 feet away from Lu Xiaoyi. Sparks flew everywhere, accompanied by the screams of the 4 Seasons sword spirit that only Lu Xiaoyi could hear. The sword spirit wasn't evil and wasn't afraid of any threat in the world. Lightning specifically targeted all kinds of spirits, including souls. Therefore, when the lightning and the sword spirit collided, it was ultimately a competition of who was stronger and whose level was higher. There was no such thing as a counter to the other. The reason why they collided less than 100 feet away was because Lu Xiaoyi was afraid that the flying swords wouldn't be able to align with the lightning. In terms of speed, the lightning was at the speed of light. The 4 Seasons sword spirit was only at the speed of sound at most. It was incomparable. However, the flying swords could still collide with the lightning because it had a big weakness: it couldn't turn. Therefore, as long as the flying swords were aligned with the lightning clouds, they wouldn't deviate too much. With just one strike, he was able to gauge the strength of the Gendanzi thunderbolt. There was a limit to its fluctuation. He was also clear about the endurance of his sword spirit. Even though the 4 Seasons sword was screaming, it did not suffer much damage. This kind of limited damage could be quickly recovered in a few days. Judging by their endurance, 4 Seasons and Ju City could face Lei Ting head-on. However, the weaker Hidden Fragrance could not. She might receive heavy damage in the process. As for Big Dipper and Luck Cutter, they should not even think about it. This kind of battle was not something they could participate in. If they rashly attacked, it was very likely that they would receive irreversible damage. After all, lightning was especially harmful to souls that had been enlightened. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly realized that in his armory, the 2 flying swords that did not have sentience were the best tools to defend against lightning. Without sentience, there was no need to be afraid of lightning strikes. At most, the swords would be destroyed, so he did not feel the pinch. There were still 2 semi-finished flying swords in his sword case. One was of the fire attribute, and the other was of the water attribute. Both of them only had 5 layers of sword array engraved on them, waiting to contain spirit. In terms of control, they were definitely not as good as other flying swords with spirits. Their power was not even worth mentioning, but at the very least, they had control. Lu Xiaoyi had played with swords for 100 years, so he had this bit of confidence, moving the 4 seasons several hundred feet away from his body, and summoning the 2 soulless flying swords of the Navy. The names were not very pleasant to hear, because these 2 things had been old for several decades, and still couldn't produce a fart. They were just cheap goods that made people angry, so he might as well just name them that way. These 2 flying swords were controlled within 500 feet. After all, they did not have a sword spirit, so their control was weaker. They did not have the ability to adjust the lightning by themselves. He chased while defending. The good news was that Lei Yiting's lightning evasion was not as good as his. It would not take long for him to close the distance between them. At that time, he would like to see how Lei Yiting's energy form could block his flying sword. From what he knew, in terms of defense, Lei Yiting was not even as good as swordsman. His calculations were very precise, and there was no mistake on the whole. There was just a slight deviation. The lightning struck again. Since the Navy was at the front, they could not completely block it. Then, annoyance continued to block it, but they could not block it. The lightning continued to strike at a speed that humans could not react to. Lu Xiaoyi felt as if he had been electrocuted. From the inside out, he felt very numb. Fortunately, he had damage reduction, the symbiosis star, and the purple star body. The damage he received was within a controllable range. However, some burns on his skin could not be avoided. It was just like the stronger electric shock of a patient in his previous life before their heart stopped beating. He could still withstand it, but it would affect his lightning evasion. Just like that, the distance that he had just regained was returned back. He finally understood Lei Yiting's battle strategy. Although his own speed was not fast, with the lightning that was sure to hit, his opponent could not be that fast either. Lightning struck down one after another. Because it was not fatal, Lu Xiaoyi did not change his strategy for the time being. It did not matter if he was in a difficult situation. He, Lu Xiaoyi, was in a difficult situation on Fish Leaping Cliff. Who would dare to laugh at him below? He felt very awkward now. In front of these famous cultivators who were ranked at the top, he did not have many ways to deal with them. Using the Navy to fight against the lightning and preparing to attack with the 4 seasons, it would be very difficult for him to catch up with the Thunder Elementalist. Under such circumstances, it was not suitable to use a close-range skill like the Heavenly Sword Ruler. This was a point that the seniors in the Bow Tower had specially reminded him. For a Foundation Establishment cultivator, the stiffness caused by the Heavenly Sword Ruler was unavoidable. It was only a matter of length. Even if Lu Xiaoyi's spirit was strong, it was only a matter of time. He was far from being able to regain control of his body immediately after the lightning evasion. This kind of loophole did not matter to an opponent who was a Dharma cultivator, because the spells of a Dharma cultivator were not fast. Even if the opponent was a swordsman, he could still use it. However, it was different with lightning. A distance of a few hundred feet was not a distance to a lightning bolt. The sound of the lightning from the other side meant that the lightning had already struck. When you were in a daze, such a blow was enough to kill you. That was why the sword cultivator seniors had repeatedly warned him that unless he had reached the nascent soul stage and grasped the Tao of Space Realm, he should not use teleportation casually under any circumstances when there was a lightning cultivator around. It would be fatal. If he switched to using the lightning evasion on top of the 4 Seasons city, he could stop enjoying the lightning treatment and increase his speed. However, which flying sword should he use as the main attack? The current Big Dipper was still unable to carry the heavy burden. Most importantly, he did not want the 4 Seasons city to be damaged while defending against the lightning. It would take time to repair. What if there were still challenges tomorrow? He would not be able to use the full strength of the flying sword. Wouldn't he be at a disadvantage? He was in a dilemma. When the opponent was getting stronger, this kind of dilemma would become very normal and also a kind of pleasure. Zhendanzi was ready to end the battle. What he did not understand was how this external sword could last for 8 years in the Fish Leaping Cliff. Other than the first flying sword that was very powerful, the other 2 were very ordinary. Well, using ordinary to describe them was a bit of an exaggeration. These 2 flying swords were not even formed. using unformed flying swords to fight. Was he looking down on him? Chapter 479. Zhendanzi was an extremely confident person. He had always believed in being himself and not caring about what others did. That would only tie him down and cause him to lose his usual sharpness and aggressiveness. Therefore, he was completely dismissive of inquiring about his opponent's techniques and battle characteristic. That was what he thought and did. In Tai Mountain sect, he only cared about cultivating and never listened to these trivial matters that spread throughout the sect. After embarking on this journey, he also traveled alone, accumulating strength along the way. He crossed the Wolf Ridge, crossed the Flat Sky Plateau, and killed his way to the top of Fish Leaping Peak. He didn't communicate with anyone during the entire journey. He was full of battle intent and the lightning was swift and fierce. He believed that it was enough. The lightning technique he was using now was called Clear Cloud Lightning. It was one of the 3 clear heavenly lightning systems. Its power was average, but it was superior in its speed of accumulation and could reach far. It was the long-range lightning of his lightning technique's combat system. Under normal circumstances, only he could lightning others at such a distance. Others couldn't do anything to him. It also had its weakness. It was very difficult to win in one strike. His true killing move was in the later part of the purple heavenly lightning system. The purple heavenly lightning was divided into Yi Wood Lightning, Yi Fire Yang Lightning, Gui Water Yin Lightning, Gung Metal Lightning, Wu Tu Infernal Lightning, Evil Punishing Lightning, God-Slaying Demonic Lightning, and Life and Death Purple Lightning. He was only in the foundation establishment stage now, so he could only practice the simplest Yi Wood Lightning and Yi Fire Yang Lightning. He could also figure out endless changes from them. His expertise lay in combining these 2 types of heavenly lightning. He cultivated a lightning formation of the Wind Forest volcano. Yang fire burned the forest, and the forest helped the fire. When used, it was majestic and endless, covering the sky and earth. Under the lightning formation, few could resist it. It was also why he was ranked 5th among the 5-ring foundation establishment stage. However, this kind of lightning formation required him to be closer to his opponent. If he was too far away, he wouldn't be able to use it easily. The lightning slowed down slightly after the initial rush of the battle. It was like the recovery of breath after exerting force. The difference was very natural and inconspicuous. However, the result was that Lu Xiaoyi's close pursuit began to slowly close the distance between them. Among the spectators, the supreme Daoist Shang Xin smiled at the people beside him. Zhendanzi is about to start his lightning formation. The forest fire formation has endless power. Many cultivators in the southeast region have been struck by lightning by him. Shuru sneered. He might not have the chance to open the thunder array. Although I'm not familiar with him, from the looks of it, I can't reach him. Ming Deng smiled. Zhendanzi's thunder array can be used within 3,000 zhong. The range of the swordsman's flying sword would not exceed 1,000 feet. The crux of the matter was, who would be able to reach who first? If both of them are within range. Behind him, Yang Fa of Ji Yuan Pavilion was calculating. If both of them are included in the shooting range, the thunderbolt will be faster than the flying sword, but it needs to accumulate power. A flying sword is slower than a thunderbolt, but it needs to fly a distance of several hundred feet. What we are competing on is the time it takes for the thunderbolt to accumulate power and the time it takes for the flying sword to leap through the air. We will see the result within 3 breaths. Shang Xin shook his head. Zhendanzi can't be faster than a flying sword. A lightning array's accumulation was different from a single lightning array's accumulation. It required at least 5 breaths of time. This guy probably doesn't know that his opponent has a long shooting range, right? Yang Fa hesitated. Do we need to find a way to tell him? After asking the question, he felt that he was very stupid. If no one present had gone up and failed, of course, they should find a way to tell him the news. But now that everyone had failed, it was better to share the joy together than to share the joy alone. Knowing his thoughts, Shuru sneered, "Don't look down on others. Don't look down on yourself. We have no obligation to inform him, because he came from thousands of miles away, alone and alone. This is his Tao. You messing with others' Tao is the right thing to do. Yang Fa nodded. It was not that he did not understand this logic. It was a little high and mighty, hiding a lot of things underneath. That's right, victory was in sight, but, Shongxin stroked his long beard, what victory? That swordsman hasn't even used his other powerful flying sword. It's obvious that he doesn't want the sword spirit to be injured. Otherwise, if he went up against the lightning, where would Zhendanzi hide? With his defense, it's just a matter of one sword. I've said it before, don't think that the Tao of Thunder is unparalleled in offense and defense. Their defense is not even as good as the swordsman's. The Tao of Thunder is about teamwork, not one-on-one combat. With a companion in charge of defense, he can fully display the power of thunder. In my opinion, among the top 10, Zhendanzi is the one with the most water, but he doesn't know it. Ming Deng sighed. Actually, winning or losing doesn't make a difference to a lightning fanzi like Zhendanzi. He lives in his own world of thunder and enjoys it to his heart's content. What's there to think about? Coming alone, leaving alone, doing things according to one's nature, perhaps this is the true attitude of a cultivator of our generation. Shongxin laughed. Doing things according to one's nature? If I were a cultivator of the Tai heavenly sect, I would also dare to do things according to my nature. Because the swordsman won't kill me. If Zhendanzi was a lightning cultivator of the supreme three pure ones, do you think he would dare to do things according to his nature? It's just a choice made after weighing the pros and cons. Don't think that lightning cultivators are simple. Their brains are full of schemes, and they are not inferior to the swordsman. Swordsman and lightning fanzi are all illusions. When they fight, they are more cunning than anyone else. The few of them were talking loudly here, but they didn't care about the result of the battle. Everyone had a process of adaptation, and when failure became a habit, the Tao heart was really difficult to explain. Persistence was the Tao heart, and giving up was also the Tao heart. Success was beneficial to the Tao heart, and failure was also beneficial to the Tao heart. For example, the Dharma cultivators now began to not compete for a short period of time. They began to compete for the future, who formed their gold core earlier, who had a higher grade of gold core, who had a faster cultivation after the Jindan. The core was that if they couldn't compete now, they would compete in the future. If they couldn't compete in the future, they would compete in the past, and so on. In the end, the Tao heart was a reason to shirk responsibility. Once they understood this, they would have the Tao heart. Lu Xiaoyi was almost burnt to a crisp. It looked frightening, but it was actually just a slight layer of carbonization on the surface of his skin. He seemed to have realized something, and so the rhythm of the battle slowed down, as if he was enjoying the feeling of being struck by lightning. The lightning cultivator was advancing and retreating. Zhendanzi could ignore the swordsman in terms of strategy, but he wouldn't be careless in terms of tactics. He also wanted to test the limits of his opponent's flying sword. There was one thing that the Dharma cultivators were right about. Just like how it was difficult for a swordsman to defend against a lightning cultivator, it was even more difficult for a lightning cultivator to defend against a swordsman. When he was within 10,000 feet of the lightning cultivator, Zhendanzi gathered a thundercloud in front of him. This was his final test. As he expected, the swordsman still didn't attack. Without hesitation, Zhendanzi conjured a lightning art. He needed 4 breaths of time. Once the 4 breaths were up, a thunderstorm would be formed. He didn't hide it anymore. He and the thundercloud both charged forward. The closer they were, the harder it would be for the lightning formation to escape. Almost at the same time, the flying sword closest to him in his consciousness, which was only a few thousand feet away, suddenly trembled. It also let out a thunderous sound and shot towards him. Zhendanzi sighed. He had miscalculated. Chapter 480. He might not be able to escape from the attack of the flying sword by merely retreating. This time, his forward charge was a little too much. In the process of approaching his opponent, the distance between them was shortened to less than 9,000 feet. The attack could not be stopped. But the thunder formation could be stopped. By changing the thunder formation into a single heavenly thunder of purple heaven, he was confident that he could hit the flying sword with a thunderbolt before it reached him. As he expected, A sharp yi-wood thunder struck the Four Seasons squarely. However, the flying sword did not deviate at all under the encirclement of the thunder and lightning. It swept past him. Zhendanzi still had a few layers of defense based on his body. They were all similar to Lu Xiaoyi's injury reduction techniques. However, the power of the flying sword was undoubtedly revealed under such circumstances. When the Four Seasons pierced through at full speed, even the professional defense of a spell cultivator would find it difficult to resist, let alone a thunder cultivator who had always focused on offense and ignored defense. Zhendanzi knew that it was not good, but he did not panic because he knew. The flying sword pierced through a few inches away from the side of his heart without releasing any sword energy. This was the most common injury caused by a puncture. For a cultivator with a strong body, it was just a small injury. Zhendanzi stopped the thunder cloud and pinched the meridians on the left and right side of the wound with his mana. The bleeding stopped immediately and the muscles collapsed, starting to heal. He clasped his hands in front of his chest and laughed in the direction of the swordsman. How embarrassing. If there's a chance, let's fight again. He did not mind at all, as if it was natural for his opponent to be merciful. This was because once he activated the thunder formation, he would not really take the swordsman's life. This was the tacit agreement between the Shenyuan sword sect and the Tai heavenly sect. Both sides had been abiding by it for tens of thousands of years. He did not stop. Since his injury was not hindered, he used the art of escape. Hence, under the gaze of tens of thousands of people, he swept past the Pingtian Plateau and flew towards the Wolf Ridge without caring about the possibility of being followed by his enemies. It was as if he had come to attend a friend's banquet and was leaving alone. Lu Xiaoyi praised in his heart. He knew that the thunder cultivator did not use his full strength, but he did not kill him ruthlessly. This was the tacit agreement between the two, the freedom of a true cultivator, and also what he yearned for. When he landed on the top of the cliff, his body trembled, and a layer of black skin fell off, making him look like a roasted sweet potato. He had gained a huge advantage in this battle. He took over the water army and savored it carefully. A small sword spirit was jumping around restlessly. There were faint flashes of light around its body, and there was even a slight crackling sound. This was a newly born sword spirit in the Navy, but it wasn't a water-type sword spirit, but a lightning-type sword spirit. He was becoming more and more confused about the formation of a sword spirit. Every time he thought he had found a way to cultivate a sword spirit, the next sword spirit would be born in a way that he could never have imagined. He realized that his limited knowledge system was still unable to explain the birth of a sword spirit. Since that was the case, there was no need to try to get to the bottom of it. At least this way, there would be occasional surprises, which was pretty good. At the beginning of the Four Seasons' birth, he had also envisioned the possibility of wholesale sword spirits, but it turned out that this was just a fantasy that he did not have a deep understanding of flying swords. Any soul that could be wholesale did not have true spirituality. Without its own characteristics, how could it be called a spirit? What's more, each sword spirit needed to be carefully cultivated by him. Up until now, he had only two sword spirits that were relatively mature, the Four Seasons and the Dew City. The hidden fragrance was still lacking, the Wu Shen had no fixed location, the Big Dipper Chopluck was still young, and now there was the lightning sword spirit of the Navy. 7 sword spirits were enough to keep him busy. He was not in a hurry to find a new sword spirit. At the Fish Leaping Cliff, it was not the time to cultivate a new sword spirit. He was not far enough to reveal his secret in front of everyone. The days began to become boring. Lu Xiaoyi felt as if he was doing a long live broadcast. Tens of thousands of people were watching him cultivate, meditate, think, eat, and if he wanted, even sleep and defecate. He was used to it, so he did not feel embarrassed. Although he never practiced his sword in front of others, the continuous breakthrough of the 7 sword spirits at the Fish Leaping Cliff did not hinder the progress of his swordsmanship at all. But the most important thing was the recollection, summary, and refinement of his state of mind during battle. Looking at the growth of his swordsmanship, it was the awakening of the sword spirits at the Four Seasons, the increase of knowledge in the 5 years at the Wolf Ridge, the new chapter after coming into contact with internal swordsmanship, the establishment of a foundation in the cave for 20 years, the qualitative leap in hard strength in the space of the peacock plume for 50 years. and the rebirth of his soft strength in the 10 years at the fish-leaping cliff. Now, he was truly confident that he could become a 5-ring hero. He was very lucky that during this process, he did not make a fool of himself at the top of the fish-leaping cliff because of his rash advancement. How many battles had he experienced here? He did not count them in detail. Probably 200 or 300 battles. In the first 2 years, there were not many challenges. From the 3rd to the 5th year, there were the most frequent challenges. From the 5th year onwards, the number of challenges decreased again, but the quality also increased. From the 7th year onwards, the number of challenges each year had decreased to single digits. Now that he had reached this stage, he was starting to lose interest in similar battles. Fighting for the sake of fighting was not a true cultivator. Lu Xiaoyi felt that he could already take a step forward to a higher level. When he first came to the 5th ring, he had the mentality of a rice worm muddling through, but now that he stood at the top of the fish-leaping cliff, his self-confidence had completely changed here. Soon, it was the 9th year. There was less than a year before the end of the 10 years. The only motivation for the spectators to stay here was the 2nd-ranked burning firewood and the 1st-ranked treasured gourd. They naturally thought that these 2 top battles would be a feast for the eyes, just like the 3rd-ranked shuru. There were more and more people because it was nearing the end. Because of the top battles, because of the history to witness after 10 years, the mysterious array of the fish-leaping cliff would transform into magical fireworks. At the same time, the name of Lu Xiaoyi would be carved on the top of the cliff, just like the other 5 names, but there were also those who left. For example, Shuru, Shongxin, Ming Deng, and a group of disciples from big sects who truly understood the essence of the sword insertion. They were very clear that there would be no more battles. The time to challenge was no longer there, and the general trend was no longer there. When the wheels of history rolled over, nothing could stop this swordsman from reaching the top. This was a truth that every true powerhouse could understand. Since that was the case, why should they stay here and become the background of someone else's glory? But in the end, those who understood were always the minority. Most people would never have their own glory in their lives. They could only replace themselves in the highlights of others, imagining themselves as the main character, and obtain satisfaction from their desires. This might be the reason why so many people were willing to stay here and watch his live broadcast. The arrival of a daoist ignited the atmosphere here to the highest level. It was burning firewood, the supreme senior brother of the Foundation establishment stage. Chapter 481. Under tens of thousands of expectant eyes, burning firewood's sleeves fluttered in the wind, and his movements were calm. The way he approached the top of the cliff was beyond everyone's expectations. He didn't carry himself in, use a barrier to climb in, or use all kinds of strange methods. He just walked in directly. The strange thing was that the swordsman didn't seem to have any intention of stopping him. Could it be that they knew each other? Under everyone's gaze, the 2 of them sat cross-legged facing each other and took out their wine jugs. Maybe they wanted to talk before the battle, and then fight. At the top of the cliff, the 2 of them drank a cup. Burning Firewood asked, "How does it feel to sit here?" Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. "Boring. I even have to hold it when I fart." Burning Firewood laughed and asked again, "What do you think of the ranking list?" Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while. "Boring." Burning Firewood laughed. "But it can satisfy some people's spiritual needs. So even though it's not beneficial to the Great Tao, it still exists, and its influence is getting bigger and bigger. In the end, the stage of Foundation establishment is still too small. Cultivators need a reasonable place to release their spiritual power." The 2 of them drank another cup. This time, it was Lu Xiaoyi's turn to ask, "Is that gourd coming or not? I'm so anxious waiting." Burning Firewood found it funny. "Do you care so much about fighting with the so-called number 1? Lu Xiaoyi played with the wine cup. "I might have cared when I first came, but I don't care now. I just don't want to wait for someone." Burning Firewood nodded. "As far as I know, the gourd seems to have hung back on the vine to seed. Wood-type spiritual monsters like them can't be measured by human time." Lu Xiaoyi expressed his understanding. There was nothing to be happy about, but he wasn't disappointed either. The 2 of them didn't talk anymore. They raised their cups and drank the third cup. Burning firewood swayed in the air. See you in the martial world. This was how strong cultivators interacted with each other. Even if they couldn't become friends at first sight, they wouldn't become mortal enemies unless it was a matter of mutual benefit. When they interacted with each other, they would control themselves and not touch each other's bottom line. This was a sign that cultivators had matured. It also meant that their mental state had reached the next level. Lu Xiaoyi did not want to prove anything by defeating him, and Burning Firewood did not want to prove himself by pulling down the swordsman. There was only one word to describe their mentality: boring. On the path of cultivation, there was no need to prove anything to others. Cultivators only needed to prove themselves. Among the top 10 5-ring foundation establishment cultivators, Lu Xiaoyi had only met 6 of them. The 10th, 3 pure ones, Yu Jiyu, was dead. The 9th, Yang Fa of the Jiyuan Pavilion, the 6th, Shong Xin, the 5th, Zhen Danzi, the 3rd, Shou Ayu, the 2nd, burned incense. There were still 4 who had not come. The reasons were different, but there was one basic reason: they did not care. Not caring was also a state of mind. They didn't care about the loss of their personal reputation, the loss of their ranking, and perhaps the cowards behind their sect. In the 5th ring, no sect would forcefully send their cultivators to obtain a ranking. In terms of cultivation philosophy, this was a kind of regression. However, the sect needed to maintain their reputation, so they would always be half-hidden. When an outstanding disciple refused, would the sect force him because he saw through the essence of honor? When Burning Firewood left, the cultivators at the foot of the Fish Leap Cliff booed loudly. It was unknown whether they were booing Burning Firewood or Lu Xiaoyi. However, the two of them didn't take this to heart. They had been waiting for a big show for almost 10 years, but one of the main actors had run away. It was understandable that they were upset. Although they also had a premonition that there might not be another big show, since they had waited for so long, they should at least watch the curtain call before leaving, right? At this time, everyone was looking forward to the number 1 treasured gourd, or the peerless foundation establishment cultivator of some hidden sect to appear out of nowhere, just like in the novels. However, a biography was a biography, and reality was reality. The reality was that there were many people fanning the flames, but none of them went up. At this time, if they went up and were killed by a sword, not only would they lose their lives, but they would also embarrass themselves and their sect. The most excited were the swordsmen. They were already discussing how to hold a grand and unique celebration ceremony. Of course, the location was at the flat sky plateau, right below the Fish Leap Cliff. This was the only place where the glory of the sword vein could be spread everywhere along with the rise of their leader. All kinds of ideas and plans were brainstormed. Countless banners and banners were being made in a hurry. They were the only happy group on the flat sky plateau, receiving the envious gazes of countless cultivators around them. Yang Bo said, "Little Yi doesn't have an opponent now, so he can't show off the power of the sword vein. Why don't I go up and fight him now?" Fish Leap Cliff, 2 swords shining. That feeling. Guang Hua, the leader at the side, immediately rejected the idea. 2 swords competing for glory, that means they're evenly matched. If the difference is too great, it'll be a flying sword chopping meat target. I say, Yang Bo, do you have any brains? What's the point of this fake fight? Do you think everyone is blind? Are you stupid? Then you'll expose the butt of my inner sword in front of all the people of the 5th ring? If you want to go up the Fish Leap Cliff, my inner sword will go up there by itself. As time passed, the 7 sword spirits on the wave-bursting cliff competed with each other. The most anxious one was the sword spirit of the navy. Seeing his brothers hitting the water in the dozens of stages while he was choking on the water in the most gentle shoal, this was intolerable for a sword spirit. Lu Xiaoyi watched quietly. He liked the atmosphere of the sword spirits chasing each other. He was happy for their every success, and sighed for their every failure. For the time being, he couldn't think of a better way to improve his swordsmanship, but that wasn't his focus now. The closer it was to the 10-year deadline, the more boring he felt sitting here. The meaningful thing was the process, and the meaningless thing was the final honor. If senior brother Guangbei could see this, would he agree to insert his broken sword here? Was he, Lu Xiaoyi, fulfilling his wish? Or was he fulfilling senior brother Guangbei's wish? Or was he using the name of senior brother Promise? Looking at the sword in the middle of the cliff, he began to doubt himself. In the past 10 years, there had been people who had tried to pull out this sword, because pulling it out meant that the person who inserted the sword had failed, or at least had to start all over again. But in front of Lu Xiaoyi, it was easier said than done to pull it out in the middle of a battle. The Fish Leap Cliff's array was very magical. No matter what your cultivation was, as long as someone wanted to pull it out, they had to use all their strength. Under the threat of the flying sword, who would have the opportunity to use all their strength to pull out the sword? Unless it was him. But now, he had an impulse to pull it out. Of course, the person who inserted the sword could also pull it out. This meant that the person who inserted the sword voluntarily gave up. But the fifth ring had its own ranking. For tens of thousands of years, there had been cultivators who died on the cliff, but there had never been a coward who knew that he couldn't beat them and gave up. Chapter 482. Lu Xiaoyi had been staring at the broken sword. He had a feeling. The 10-year period was coming to an end. Lu Xiaoyi had stabbed the sword at dusk, so it would be dusk when it ended. The formation on the cliff began to flicker, signifying the end of a cycle. The onlookers couldn't help but rush forward. Tens of thousands of people didn't have anyone to protect them. The order was suddenly in chaos. Brothers and sisters of the same sect were often separated from each other. But it didn't matter. For cultivators who could fly, it was impossible for them to be trampled. In the chaos, a cultivator noticed a figure flying to the top of the cliff. It was flapping its wings at a very fast speed. It was a winged bird. It wasn't a rare flying beast in the fifth ring, but its behavior made the onlookers daydream endlessly. Was it the arrival of a real master? There were still 2 hours left. There was enough time for a life-and-death battle. Only a few cultivators of the Red Sun sect were shouting at the back. "Xiaosu, come back. Do you want to die?" The scene was chaotic. Their cultivation was shallow. As the sword stabbing was coming to an end, they relaxed. It was difficult for anyone to keep an eye on one person for years. In the end, they lost control of Xiaosu. Cultivators all knew how to be respectful. The higher their level, the more so. They knew what they should do and what they shouldn't do. But if it was a Qi cultivator who had informed the Taoist foundation, a reckless and arrogant girl who had been spoiled, when glory was about to come, and it was obtained by stepping on her father's corpse, she would have the impulse to disregard everything. When everyone found out that it was just a Qi cultivator, their hope turned into surprise. The battle turned into a farce. A few disciples of the Red Sun sect were far away. They found it too late and didn't have time to stop it. The others were just watching the show. Maybe it was a peerless master who disguised himself as a Qi cultivator. Only one person was allowed to get close to the fish-leaping cliff. While the onlookers were still hesitating, the winged bird had already flown into the forbidden area. Xiaosu was so excited that she didn't care about life and death. The worst thing was to meet her father. The winged bird flew very fast. In the blink of an eye, it was thousands of feet away. No flying sword. In that case, he would continue flying forward until he was face to face with the ferocious person sitting cross-legged at the top of the cliff. Seeing the swordsman's calm gaze, Xiao Chou's heart skipped a beat. Impulsiveness was impulsiveness, and reality was reality. With such a huge difference in strength, she could lose her life at any time. She was a little scared, however, she had already come this far. She did not want to give in at the last moment. "You killed my father. He was only an old man in his twilight years. He's not a threat to you." Lu Xiaoyi did not show any sympathy, even if it was just an act. He came up on his own. I didn't invite him. In the cultivation world, there is no such thing as being old or young. He is a cultivator. This is the essence. Xiao Kai's emotions fluctuated. You're a murderer, a butcher. Hundreds of people lost their lives in the fish-leaping cliff just to make you famous? Lu Xiaoyi frowned. In the world of cultivation, everyone is a murderer. If I sit here, there will be people coming up to challenge me. If I carry a bag of spirit stones and walk in the Wolf Ridge, there will still be people coming to rob me. It wasn't me who killed them, it was greed. The pursuit of fame. The repayment to the sect. The pursuit of one's own great Tao. What reason do I have to give up my own future to make the future of others? Your father is the same. He's not any nobler than me. Xiao Kai was unable to refute. Her father had said these words to her before. What she did not expect was that not only was her strength inferior to him, she was also inferior to him in terms of bickering. She angrily drew her sword and pointed it at him. You have no reason to use others as your stepping stones. How many people have lost their loved ones? How many people have lost their friends? How many people have lost their fellow disciples that they spent their days with? Don't you people pay attention to the Tao heart? When you dream in the middle of the night, when you face the upper realm, these are nightmares that you will never be able to escape from. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and said seriously, I won't. Cultivators should not have loved ones. Fellow disciples are just passers-by that everyone walks together. As for friends, how could your understanding be wrong? As for the Tao heart, let me tell you. The so-called Tao heart is that if you think it's right, then it's right. Not to mention 100 people, even if it's 1,000 or 10,000 people blocking my path, they deserve to die. This is the Tao heart. You're a devil. Xiao Kai led the sword forward. Blood rushed to her head and she stabbed forward. Of course, she knew that she could not hurt him. She was only thinking that it was time to go down and meet her father. The other party did not evade or dodge, treating it as if it was nothing. When a Foundation Establishment cultivator activated his body technique, the sword of a Qi refinement warrior could not pierce through. The long sword trembled violently. She had wanted to aim for the head or the eyes. This might be the only place that could be stabbed, but she could not. Her heart and hands were flustered. She could only aim for the chest. Since she was going to die anyway, it did not matter. However, death did not come for a long time. Looking at the other party's calm gaze, Xiao Kai gritted her teeth and stabbed the tip of the sword into his body. Actually, she did not know whether the sword had stabbed into his body or not. She had never killed anyone before. A drop of blood flowed out from the tip of the sword. It was just a drop, but it made her extremely confused. She wanted to increase her strength, but it was as if she was stabbing a rock. She could not go any deeper. Lu Xiaoyi used his finger to push away the tip of the sword and frowned. Look, killing someone is very simple, but it's useless for you to kill me. If you want to stop me, you might as well pull out that sword. Looking at the girl's suspicious gaze, he guided her patiently. I'm a Foundation Establishment cultivator, a very powerful one. Even if I'm at the critical moment of cultivation and can't move, you can't kill me. But if you want to destroy my 10 years of cultivation, you can try to pull out that sword. If I can pull it out, I will fail. Relatively speaking, it's easier. It's also your father's wish. Xiao Kai was a little confused. She just wanted to say what she wanted to say and then seek death. But she did not expect that the direction of things completely deviated from the normal script. Of course, she did not believe this murderer, but the problem was that it seemed that she really had no other way except what he said. Anyway, she had to try first. If she could not pull out the sword, she could use the talisman in the storage ring. Even if she could not kill him, she could still hurt him, right? So she walked over, grabbed the sword hilt and pulled it up. It did not move at all. The murderer next to her side, use all your strength. Use all your strength. Believe in yourself. You will succeed. The girl's intuition told her that there was a problem, a big problem, but how could she understand the reason behind it with her mediocre level? She just subconsciously used all her strength and reminded herself that if it still did not work, she would continue to kill that murderer until she used up all her talismans and could no longer lift the sword. With this mentality, she was surprised to find that the sword was being pulled out little by little under her full strength. Was this the will of the heavens? The will of the heavens did not allow this murderer to become famous. Chapter 483. The fish-leaping cliff array allowed the challenger to pull out the sword. The premise was that you had to use all your strength. You couldn't be distracted. So in theory, If the foundation establishment stage could pull out the sword, the qi refining stage could also pull it out. Regardless of the level of cultivation of the person who pulled out the sword, everyone was dumbfounded. Whether it was the tens of thousands of cultivators below the cliff or Xiaotu himself, only one person felt at ease about this. When Xiaotu completely pulled out the sword from the top of the cliff, the entire fish-leaping cliff array suddenly extinguished. The light and shadow disappeared and returned to the previous lifeless atmosphere. Only at this time did everyone understand that this magical scene had really happened. It was so real that it was unbelievable. 10 years of suffering was destroyed in a day. Xiaotu held the broken sword in a daze, not knowing what he had done. A hand reached out from the side and took the broken sword. With a slight shake, the broken sword shattered into countless pieces and scattered to the top of the cliff. This was what senior brother Guangbei wanted, right? Why did he have to reach the top after coming here? The most important thing was the process. His body swayed in the air and his flirtatious nature burst out. My sword is flat and proud, I don't care about the matchmaker. I return to be a high chariot, I don't break the Osman thus after ascending the dragon. Laughing loudly, he disappeared from the top of the fish-leaping cliff. He was satisfied. At the bottom of the fish-leaping cliff, the cultivators exploded. Too irresponsible. After 10 years of foreplay, at the most crucial moment, you ran away with your pants up. How could you do that? Yang Bo looked at the countless celebratory items prepared and said hatefully, I knew this kid was unreliable. I knew it from the first time I saw him. Even now, he's still like this. Doesn't he know how to empathize with everyone's feelings? No one paid attention to him. Many people were secretly thinking, why did the boss do this? Was it deliberately mysterious? Or did he have a deeper meaning? Those who thought deeply had a different understanding, those who thought shallowly felt like they were shrouded in fog. Yang Bo was also preparing to leave. She didn't feel surprised. If she could really guess this guy's thoughts, that would be strange. Lan Chong stopped her. Senior sister, my senior brother Fei asked me to pass this to you. Originally, I wanted to pass it to senior brother Fei first, but since he has already left, it's the same to pass it to senior sister directly. But Yang Chen did not take it. It was a sword sheath, the sword sheath of Wei Sword Mountain. For something as important as the Shenyuan sword pill, how could she accept such a valuable gift for nothing? Furthermore, their origins were unknown. He said vigilantly, I can't take it. Who was senior brother Fei? Why haven't I heard of it before? Lan Chong laughed. Our Weijian Mountains Foundation establishment eldest senior brother, Fei Chai. Oh, just call him by his other Dharma name, senior martial sister will know. Cigarette butt, Lu Xiaoyi. Senior martial brother said that senior martial sister is lacking a sword case. Since senior martial brother is at fish leaping, we asked someone to bring it over. Yang Chang was speechless. Of course, she knew about this story. She also knew that Lu Xiaoyi had promised to get her a sword sheath from the Wei Sword Mountain, but she did not expect it to be in such a way. His eldest senior brother was in high demand. After Shenyuan pulled him away, Wei Zhenshan immediately picked him up. His actions were swift. Where did this guy run off to? Back to the dome? Or did he go for a stroll? Lu Xiaoyi sped through the peaks of Wolf Ridge, feeling carefree. In the depths of his sea of consciousness, the cluster of luck was slowly returning to normal. This was the benefit of not leaving his name in the annals of history after 10 years. In terms of Dao heart, he had not reached the level where he could treat honor as nothing. After 10 years of hard work, if he finally let go, he would not only be letting down his own efforts, he would also be letting down the arrangement of the rankings, and he would also disappoint countless cultivators. Why bother? The mystery was in this cluster of luck. In the 3rd year since Lu Xiaoyi came to fish leaping, he noticed that the color of his cluster of luck had slightly darkened. At first, he thought that it was because he used the cluster of luck to practice the luck-severing flying sword, but after some observation, he realized that his guess might not be correct. Fate was not something that a mere foundation establishment cultivator could meddle with. Even though he came from the most powerful 5-ring swordsman system, he did not find a single word about fate in the Bo Ao Tower. This should be something that one could only come into contact with after reaching at least the Yuaniing realm. Therefore, the cluster of luck in his sea of consciousness was an inanimate object to him. Unless it showed some special abnormalities, he could only guess according to the current environment and situation, which was very passive. All of this changed after 50 years in the peacock plume space. He did not know the reason, but it was in the peacock plume that he had a preliminary understanding of this mysterious cluster of luck and successfully cultivated the luck-severing sword spirit. It was also because of this preliminary understanding that he had more associations with the changes in the cluster of luck in his sea of consciousness. He had been silently observing, judging, eliminating the false and retaining the true. In the end, he came to the conclusion that the changes in the cluster of luck seemed to be related to some kind of karma. Karma was a level that Foundation establishment cultivators could not touch. Although Foundation establishment cultivators could not understand it in depth, karma was something that affected everyone at all times, regardless of their realm, including mortal. Counting the changes in the cluster of luck in his sea of consciousness for 10 years, it was basically the same as the changes in the number of people he killed. When he killed the most, the changes in the cluster of luck were the greatest. The first 2 to 3 years, and the last 2 years were the periods when the changes were the least. This made him understand a principle. The number of people he killed could really affect a person's luck. There might be a minimum limit to how much he could earn. For example, he had earned quite a lot of kills in the previous battles, but over a long period of time, the impact would be negligible. However, if he killed a lot of people in a short period of time, like what he had done in the past few years, the changes to the luck hunter group were obvious. It was not a good sign. What would the changes in luck affect? Lu Xiaoyi was not sure. It might not reverse a certain process, but it would exert an additional influence on the process, increasing the difficulty, causing all kinds of accidents and troubles. This was the way to exert the influence of the changes in luck. What could Lu Xiaoyi be affected by now? It was time for him to consider the problem of core formation. Therefore, this was an influence that could not be ignored. It might decide the final result. An intriguing historical record was that after the 5 rings had a ranking list, the 5 people who succeeded in inserting the sword were already history. The highest achievement was only at the Yin spirit realm, 3 Yuaniing, 1 Jin Dan, and none of them had a primordial spirit. How could this be? These 5 people were the real geniuses. Then, would this be a huge trap? The target was those people who were amazing from the beginning of the Foundation establishment stage. Using the ranking list to cut off their future? Who was the strongest in the cultivation world in terms of personal combat power? It was said that tens of thousands of years ago, there was a senior who did it. What the Dharma lineage regretted the most was that they did not kill this freak when he was in his adulthood, so there was a ranking list. Even 5 of the Dharma lineage's genius disciples had fallen into it. What did it matter? The Dharma lineage never lacked rising stars. Perhaps, the person behind the ranking list only wanted to cut off a certain sword vein's glory and rise again. If not for the group of chasers, he would not have discovered this hidden danger. He had always been suspicious. Where did the ranking list of the 5 rings come from? It was so pervasive and favored Lu Xiaoyi. Even though he tried to keep a low profile, he could not avoid being firmly pushed to the 11th place. How could the Dharma lineage not be involved in a major matter like the 5 rings that controlled the direction of public opinion? They were the most likely instigators behind the scenes, so what was the point of doing so? Of course, he did not know that the Dharma lineage would rather lose 5, 50, or even 500 geniuses than allow another unsolvable freak to appear in the sword vein. This was a trap. He did not understand it, but it did not mean that he was unaware of the danger involved. Things had already happened. The dead could not be resurrected. If he wanted to achieve a breakthrough in the history of cultivation, he could only build on the deaths of countless people. The number of people he killed in the process of the fish leaping over the cliff could not be considered high in history. This was because he had shocked many people with his thunderous methods at the beginning. However, even with his caution, he could not stop the change in the group of chasers. The problem was, how could he solve it? This was not an injury that could be solved by swallowing a pill and circulating his Dharma power a few times. When it came to mysteries, they could only be solved with mysteries. Mysteries would not fade with the passage of time. This was what Lu Xiaoyi had been thinking about when he leaped over the cliff. It was only in the last 1 or 2 years that he made some progress. Chapter 484. What he was aiming for was karma. Although he didn't understand the true meaning of karma, it didn't stop him from measuring this thing with a normal attitude. He had always thought that if he was an ordinary cultivator without any purpose, carrying a bag of spirit stones that everyone envied, people would constantly come up to provoke him and rob him, resulting in endless deaths and injuries. Then, should his luck change because of this? It shouldn't. Because he was only protecting himself. It was others who were greedy. He shouldn't be responsible for any deaths and injuries in the process and bear the karma. When Yu stabbed his sword, it was others who came to him. But he could get something from this. He had a purpose at the top of Yu Peak. Just like showing a big bag of spirit stones here to lure others to rob him and achieve his purpose. This difference between initiative and passivity was the key to the change in his luck. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could change the result. What if he didn't get what he wanted when he first came? What if he chose to give up because he understood something? Then, would there be a wonderful change in this karma? He was a cultivator who came to Yu Peak to comprehend the Tao heart. He didn't have any other purpose. Would karma be lenient to people who purely comprehended the Tao? So that it wouldn't affect the change in his luck. This was a complicated decision, including the change in his own spirit, a deeper understanding of Guangbei's promise, and the protection of his own group of luck. The result was good. Although the group of luck in his sea of consciousness hadn't completely returned to the state it was 10 years ago, it was much stronger than before Yu Peak was defeated. It was basically within the acceptable range of change. What did he lose? Was it just a false reputation left on the cliff? It was very likely to be a huge trap. What did he get? In the 10 years of sword fighting, the number of opponents was more than 10 times the number of opponents in the 5 rings combined. Where could he find so many people to practice with? This business gave him countless experience, rare training in sword skills, a sword spirit, and a clearer state of mind. Did he change? If it wasn't for Guangbei, he wouldn't have come. So he didn't change. Did he understand? He understood. So, what were the rules? Trampling on the rules was a skill. I'm here, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to feel good, and I'm not going to tease you anymore. He had a premonition that after he did this, even more people would be disdainful of the 5th ring leaderboard. This shouldn't be something that cultivators should do. He couldn't be the first to successfully insert a sword, but he could successfully destroy the rankings. Later generations would judge that there was a swordsman who ruined the pursuit of tens of thousands of years. Just the thought of it makes me happy. It was even more satisfying than killing someone. That was a slap to the faces of those behind the rankings. However, Lu Xiaoyi also understood a principle from this. Even if his strength was outstanding, this person really could not be killed indiscriminately. There was a pair of eyes staring at every cultivator, recording their actions and reflecting all of this in the future direction of their luck. If cultivators continued to ignore them, they would eventually change your future, no matter how high your potential was or how strong your background was. The only method a cultivator could use to avoid all of this was their mental state. The state of mind of a true cultivator. A year later, Erhai, Weijian Mountain. The red mine was still the same, and the scenery was still the same. Well, this place could not be said to have any scenery at all. The land was originally barren, and in addition to its fierce reputation, it was not an exaggeration to describe it as a barren land of thousands of miles. Mortals regarded it as a forbidden area. In the sky, from time to time, there would be cultivators riding their swords across the sky. They were in high spirits, and the sword light was swift and fierce without any concealment. This place was the same as the dome of Shenyuan. There was no protective formation here. It was not that they couldn't do it, but they were not willing to do it. This was also the tradition of the sword vein. They were not willing to hide in the mountain and be attacked by others. They had always taken the initiative to attack. This was a kind of cultivation attitude. As long as there was a person, everything was possible. Of course, it was impossible for them to be completely unprepared. The basic identification was necessary, just like the warning formation in Shenyuan. Weijian Mountain also had such a thing. It would automatically identify cultivators entering and exiting. There were several identification marks, sword talismans, sword boxes, and when they reached Jindan, they would directly answer with their spiritual awareness. A sword light swept from afar and did not stop. When it passed through the identification formation, the sword talismans and sword boxes on the cultivator's body trembled at the same time and then returned to normal. The sword talismans and sword boxes responded at the same time. This was the most authentic swordsman of Weijian Mountain. Regarding this, Jin Dan, who was in charge of monitoring the formation, did not even bother to look at the name. There were countless of such disciples entering and exiting every day. There were not many who knew their place. The sword light did not hesitate. It circled around the red mine a few times and found a single house made of earth and landed directly on it. This was the residential area of Weijian Mountain's foundation establishment cultivators. In the cultivation world, it was called an abode of immortals. In fact, how many of them actually dug an abode of immortals? Especially those like Weijian Mountain who did not care about it at all. The interior of the house was relatively decent. At least it had been cleaned in the past year. There was not much dust. One must know that the owner of this house had not returned for close to 80 years. Lu Xiaoyi wanted to use a purification technique to at least clean up this place. He used his mana. Wind was released, but he could not control it well. Instead, it blew the dust everywhere. He did not care about it and just let it be. He was not a person who was strict about the environment. In this place, he actually had a Dharma name. It belonged to Weijian Mountain, Fei Chai. There were many reasons why he came to Weijian Mountain and not back to the dome. It was not because he was swayed by his emotions. He was a meticulous person. He had killed so many cultivators from other sects at the fish leaping cliff. It was hard to say whether or not they had any intention of revenge. It was said that a cultivator must have a Tao heart, but it was not absolute. If they were magnanimous, the competition for the 5 rings would not be like this. The cultivation world in the universe would not be unpredictable. Rules were meant to be broken. If you showed your talent and did something that others could not do, you would definitely be the one who stood out. He did not want to cause any more trouble. He also did not want to bring trouble to his fellow disciples in Shenyuan. It took almost 2 years to return to the dome from Fish Jump Cliff. It only took 1 year to come to Weijian Mountain. The journey was unexpected. It was safer. From Weijian Mountain to the dome, if he used teleportation, it would be a matter of seconds. There was no difference. But he wanted to stay in Weijian Mountain for a while because he liked the desert shape here. He felt that he was being targeted when he was cultivating in the dome. He knew that it was not because of his principles. There were many reasons why he felt strange. He just did not want to explain everything, including his sword spirit, the secret of the peacock plume, and the origin of the battle in Fish Jump. For some people, even if you explained it to them 10,000 times, they would still look at you with suspicion. He was a little tired of it. He was too lazy to explain, too lazy to say. It was that simple. He needed to calm down and make a plan for himself. He needed an environment where he would not be disturbed. He needed a vigorous atmosphere. On this point, Chenxiu Mountain was not as good as Weijian Mountain. In terms of the temperament of the external sword, Weijian Mountain faced the huge pressure of the 3 pure ones in Erhai alone. This toughness was much stronger than Chenxiu Mountain, who relied on the internal sword. This was a type of temperament. Without experiencing the wind and rain, without the precipitation of history, it could not be cultivated. As for what the elders in the dome would think, he did not care. In these 10 years, he finally understood the cultivation world. He understood Shenyuan and his position in it. There was no need to be timid. Swordsman had to straighten his back and be a person, whether it was the enemy or his own sect. He did not betray his sect. His identity in Weijian Mountain was arranged by the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. Chapter 485. The residences of the cultivators in Weijian Mountain were very messy. The residences of Jindan and Foundation Establishment cultivators were not strictly segregated. This was the characteristic of Weijian Mountain. In fact, Yuanying were also mixed in. It was just that they were rarely seen. In an ordinary residence, Yinyi was entertaining a guest. It was his senior, Wang Ding, who had just returned after a few decades. In Weijian Mountain, the Dharma names of swordsmen were not so strict and were not based on seniority. They were all named by themselves. Once the elders saw that there was no problem, they would tacitly agree. Therefore, one could not tell the seniority from their Dharma names. Yin Yi and his senior, Wang Ding, joined the sect in the same year and were very close. They came all the way to Jindan. In the world of cultivation, there were not many people who could get along like this. Their gatherings were very casual. They would discuss Tao, practice swordplay, and even drink and eat meat. They did not have a sense of time. Until now, the two of them had been together for a few days. They were not done talking and their appetites were gradually increasing. Senior, you are so lucky. 3 years ago, someone gave me a red mountain goat. I left it outside. Now that I think about it, it's time to roast it with wine. It's a good thing in life. As they spoke, they pursed their lips and waited for the goat to come. In Weijian Mountain, there were actually very few living creatures. Some of the gluttonous people would often catch animals and raise them around their residences. They would leave a mark and let them run around. This way, the meat would be extra chewy. There were not many plants in the red earth mine. There was only a type of root plant that was spread all over the mine. It was suitable for some animals to eat. After a few years, the meat would be extra delicious. Cultivators did not desire good food. Therefore, it was impossible for them to form an industry. Most of them raised a few animals for their own use. Everyone would leave a mark on the animals to show the difference. Of course, there was no stealing here. That was why there was such an irresponsible method. However, after Yinyi called for it, there was no response. Wang Ding laughed. It seems like I don't have the luck to eat it. Blue goats that were raised in the mine would sometimes go missing, but they were not fresh. It was not caused by humans, but by various other reasons. It was merely an ordinary beast, not worth the attention of cultivators. Even the cultivators of Jindan did not have to place any restrictions on the body of the goat. They just followed the nature of the beast and gave it freedom. It was just a small trick. The two of them were slightly regretful, but they did not take it to heart. There was food and wine in the ring, it was just that they did not roast it fresh. Yinyi then asked, Senior Marshal Brother went to the subordinate star. What did you see? I see that the number of subordinate stars of the 5 rings is increasing day by day. As the saying goes, a big tail can't be shaken. I wonder if these subordinate stars can really affect the trajectory of the 5 rings? Subordinate stars could be any kind of celestial body, such as meteorites, asteroids, satellites, comets, nebulas, and so on. The 5-ring star field was an enormous celestial body that moved on its own. The celestial bodies that it bumped into along the way also possessed an extremely powerful attractive force. In the tens of thousands of years of the universe's operation, under the coincidence of the environment, it could often attract some relatively light celestial bodies to follow it and firmly attract it to the surroundings of the 5 rings. To be precise, the current 5 rings was no longer a simple, single, superlarge celestial body. It was more like a moving galaxy. With the 5 rings as the center, there were hundreds of celestial bodies of all kinds that followed it from afar, not abandoning it. These celestial bodies were called subordinate stars. Wang Ding did not take it to heart. Whether or not it will affect the trajectory of the 5 rings is not something we should consider. Let the great cultivators decide. Lai and the Peacock Palace will deal with it. However, this time I followed Marshal Uncle to a small planet that was recently added to the orbit, and there were some strange gains. While the two of them were talking, they felt a cultivator poking his head in from outside their residence. It was very unruly. With a slight sweep of their divine sense, they found that it was a foundation establishment cultivator leading a goat. Wang Ding laughed. I'm quite lucky. Someone actually brought your goat back. Speaking of which, how did he know that we were going to roast the goat today? The person came closer and closer, and at the same time, a voice was heard. Is Martial Uncle Yinyi here? Disciple Fei Chai has come to ask for guidance. Yinyi was very surprised. He never thought that the one who came from the thousands of foundation establishment disciples of Wei Jian Mountain would be this person. He answered, Come in. Wang Ding was very surprised. Jindan cultivators gathered to discuss the Tao, especially in such a private place. Even other senior and junior brothers of the same realm might not be welcome, so how could such a disciple be allowed to come in? It was normal for him to put down the goat and leave by himself. Sensing his doubts, Yinyi smiled. This is the disciple I told you about who was stolen from Shenyuan. He came back from Fishleap, but I don't know why he came to my Wei Jian Mountain first. He's a very interesting person. Senior martial brother, are you willing to meet him? Wang Ding was very interested. Firstly, it was because of the identity of Xuanyuan's disciple. Secondly, this guy had not lost in Fishleap for 10 years, but in the end, he deliberately lost to a Qi practitioner. He was very unique. Such a person was naturally different from ordinary foundation establishment disciples. I want to meet him, I want to meet him. A sword inserter rarely seen in 1,000 years. Let me open my eyes and see how heroic he is, an outstanding person who can suppress all heroes. Lu Xiaoyi walked in with a solemn expression while leading the goat. His figure was tall and straight, and his eyebrows were sharp like knives. What a young man with a sword inserter. He bowed to the two Jindan cultivators and said, I have nothing to show my respect to from afar. I specially offer you a fat sheep outside the mouth as a token of my respect. Wang Ding's shoulders trembled. Yinyi felt that countless vulgarities were about to come out of his mouth, but he forced them back down. This guy actually took his master's things to give his master a gift. And a fat sheep outside the mouth. Wang Ding deliberately tempted him. Carrying a goat from afar, it's the thought that count. You're really respectful to your martial uncle Yin. Lu Xiaoyi was smart and immediately realized that something was wrong. He had caught the goat not far away, and it was just a casual move. He had only stayed at Wei Jian Mountain for a limited time last time, so he didn't know much about the situation here. Anyway, in the Shenyuan Dome, anything that wasn't locked in a cage was ownerless. However, a slight movement could attract the attention of the two Jindan cultivators. Therefore, he couldn't brag that he had to carry it back. His smile was very pure. It's not that I traveled thousands of miles. There was a fat and silly goat at the foot of the mountain. I saw that there was something wrong with it, and I even used some tricks on it, so I returned its freedom. After thinking about it again, I haven't seen Martial Uncle for decades, so I might as well catch it and roast it as a token of my sincerity. Yinyi didn't know whether to be angry or to laugh. Every time this thing came, he had to spend a lot of money. The previous time, he had spent a lot of time to make up for it. This time, it was starting again. Since that's the case, you can roast it as a welcoming feast for your martial uncle Wang Ding. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. His hands were nimble, and he was very familiar with removing the fur, skin, and blood. Yinyi asked, Fei Chai, why didn't you return to your dome after Fishleap? Why did you come to Wei Jian Mountain? Lu Xiaoyi fawned over him. It's because I haven't been to Wei Jian Mountain for a long time, and I missed Martial Uncle. Yinyi glared at him. Speak human language. Lu Xiaoyi laughed dryly. Isn't this place close? I killed a lot of people at Fishleap, so. Chapter 486. Lu Xiaoyi started to roast the lamb. The fastest way for a cultivator to cook was to use fire techniques. However, one had to pay attention to the taste of food. If one did not want convenience, it would be best to roast it slowly. For example, in this situation, one should roast it slowly with ordinary fire and brush it with seasoning before drinking it slowly. Only then would it be interesting. As soon as he lit the fire, the two golden core cultivators shook their heads. His fire elemental techniques were terrible, and he was so stupid to light firewood. Presumably, he wouldn't be able to control the fire when roasting. A good sheep would be ruined by him. Yin Yi was very impatient. Go go go, let me do it. It was his own lamb and he had to serve it himself. He did not know how he got to this position. As he roasted the lamb, he asked, "What do you want to ask me?" Lu Xiaoyi said seriously, "First, the defense of external swords. Second, the essentials of core formation. Please don't mind my presumptuousness." Yin Yi nodded. He was very satisfied that Lu Xiaoyi came to Weijian Mountain to ask these questions. This meant that he did not treat him as an outsider here. Although he had tricked Shen Yuan into joining him, he would never be able to change Xuanyuan's position in his heart. However, it was still a blessing for him to have such a good swordsman to be able to help him grow. Talking about the future, this Lu Xiaoyi was very much to his liking. The key was that his strength and potential were limitless. He was worth a lot of effort to nurture. What presumptuousness! Don't say such hypocritical words in Weijian Mountain in the future. If you really think it's presumptuousness, you shouldn't have come. You have to remember that you have a name in the sword book of Weijian Mountain. You are a member of my Weijian Mountain. In the future, I will not say it's presumptuousness when I use you. You don't have to feel embarrassed when you come here to cheat for food, drink, skills, and insights. Lu Xiaoyi laughed dryly. Martial uncle, how can this be called cheating? Yin Yi ignored him and said, I have some insights about the defense of external sword. In the sword vein, let's not talk about internal swords. That is not the same path as us. Let's just talk about your Chenxiu Peak. The concept of swordsmanship is not as good as Weijian Mountain. For a swordsman, defense shouldn't be their first priority. This is our principle. Replacing defense with offense is our core principle. Making the opponent unable to attack and perform improperly is always the first choice. You are known as the first heavy sword and the first long-range sword in Fish Leap. I think you know this very well. I don't need to say more. Yin Yi continued as he spun the sheep and harvested the materials. But there will always be accidents, exceptions, and inconveniences. In battle, under special circumstances, when you can't use offense to replace defense, we need to have our own method. Nothing is absolute. Cultivation is a kind of balance. Being too extreme is not in line with the path of cultivation. Therefore, even my Wei Sword Mountain has to be defended. In terms of defense alone, there are 3 strategies: top, middle, and bottom. He took a sip of wine and watched as Lu Xiaoyi listened attentively. Only then did he explain, the worst plan is the best. Even among the swordsmen, there were many who had learned defensive techniques with mana meridians. They mainly relied on talismans, and with the combination of speed, they were able to escape from a temporary predicament and look for an opportunity to counterattack. This was a temporary measure. If the sword was wrong, the sword technique would be wrong, and in the end, nothing would be accomplished. It was just a temporary measure for a new foundation establishment cultivator. The middle plan was the sword. No matter if it was Wei Sword Mountain or your Shen Yuan, there were many defensive sword techniques that could be learned. However, the path of the sword was mainly for offense. Using the sword to defend would result in twice the effort for half the result. The best plan was the sword formation. This was also what I wanted to recommend to you. I noticed that your mental strength is different from ordinary people. You have the basic ability to control a sword formation. Therefore, you can find some basic sword formations to learn and improve your defense. Sword formation? This was a direction that Lu Xiaoyi had not thought of at all. It was also a new direction for him. Yin Yi reminded, don't be greedy for more. I know that you are of the constellation system. You can't wait to learn the heavenly cycle constellation sword technique and create the hardest turtle shell. For beginner sword formations, start from the simplest. From there, you can grasp the balance and cooperation between the flying swords, the concept of the sword formation, and the coordination of offense and defense. Wei Sword Mountain had many of these beginner sword formations. For example, the yin-yang sword wall, the 3-talent sword formation with 3 flying swords, the 3 primordial sword chi formation, and so on. When you have completely grasped the basic concept of the sword formation, You can then look for the most suitable sword formation for yourself. For example, the Big Dipper formation. However, there is no Big Dipper formation in Wei Sword Mountain. Our sword formation is more simple, unlike Shen Yuan who wanted to steal everything from their mana meridians. Sword formations were like juggling balls and rings. One had to start with 2 balls and gradually increase the number of balls after mastering them. If you start with 7 balls and 10 rings, you can imagine the efficiency. Ordinary people relied on the dexterity of their hands to control the balls and rings. Cultivators relied entirely on their spirit and had a high requirement on their mental strength. After all, the burden of controlling 1 flying sword and 7 flying swords was completely different. Therefore, in the sword vein, there were very few swordsmen who practiced sword formations. They usually started with Jindan, and only at the Yuanying stage could they fully unleash the power of the sword formation. To Lu Xiaoyi, this was a very good direction. In fact, his mental strength was different from ordinary people. However, he was often unable to unleash his advantage in battle. The range of his sword was too far and there were very few opportunities for him to use his mental strength to shock others. Furthermore, with the help of the sword spirits, his mental strength consumption was also much lower than other swordsmen. Although he had a strong mental strength, he was unable to unleash it in battle. This had always bothered him. Now, he finally had a suitable direction. The old swordsman was much stronger than him in this aspect. Just like what Yin Yi said, he could first learn the sword formation formed by 2 or 3 flying swords in Wei Jian Mountain. After he had mastered it, he could then return to the Dome Peak to learn the Big Dipper sword formation. He just so happened to have 7 sword spirit. His train of thought was very clear. Based on the number of sword spirits he had now, he was afraid that he would rarely use a sword formation like the Big Dipper sword formation which required 7 flying swords. In most of his battles, he would use 4 or 3 flying swords to attack and 3 or 4 flying swords to defend. Then, the most practical sword formation would be the ordinary 4-element sword formation. Yin Yi saw that he was thinking by himself and ignored him. He began to eat meat and drink wine with Wang Ding. There were very few people who practiced sword formations in Wei Jian Mountain, so there was no need to force it. However, this little guy was different. He was already standing at this position. He was not an ordinary person and could not be measured by ordinary people's thinking. After a while, seeing that this little guy seemed to have thought it through and began to eat meat and drink wine, Yin Yi could not help but feel depressed again. He had to teach him swordsmanship and feed him. He even had to know his feelings because he was the one who brought the sheep here. Did he steal a father? He snorted, "I will only teach you swordsmanship. As for forming the core, senior brother Wang Ding is the true expert. He formed a high-grade core. He has a lot of experience in this area and his theories are unique. If you serve him well, he will leave a few words for you. You will benefit from it for the rest of your life." Lu Xiaoyi stood up respectfully. This disciple salutes martial uncle. There is plenty of wine. Little Yi will accompany you with his life. Yin Yi took a deep breath. The special wine was also his. Chapter 487. Wang Ding was also amused. Your martial uncle doesn't have any other hobbies except for the red cliff goats in this mine. The cliff goats near your martial uncle Yin Yi's residence are especially tender. Go get a few more when you have time. I won't hide anything about the mysteries of core formation. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Don't worry, uncle. As long as I am in Wei Jian Mountain, I will come here often. If there are any cliff sheep, they will not be able to escape from me. Wang Ding smiled and said seriously, the Jindan of Taoism uses the human body as a cauldron, using the essence and qi in the body as medicine. Using the spirit to refine the essence, qi, and spirit, they can condense to form a sacred fetus and be reborn. The Daoist scripture Big Cave scripture says, cave source and enlightenment, all Daos are born from the same source. The heart wants to move but the spirit doesn't stop, the body wants to move but the consciousness doesn't separate, the soul wants to come out but the spirit doesn't molt. These are the precursors to the formation of the aurous core. At the beginning, the qi is connected, at the second, the spirit is connected, at the end, the The spirit is connected. At the end, the spirit is connected. The Xiao Yaro technique passed down by the ancestors only teaches to concentrate the spirit into the core point. Those who concentrate the spirit will receive the thoughts into the heart. This heart is not the heart of flesh and blood, but the heart of the middle palace. It is located below the Jiang Gong, above the Shen Q, behind the Zhong Wan, before the spine. It is in the middle of the human body. It is not a point, but a circle of nothingness. It is as big as the universe and as small as a mustard seed. It has a shape and a strong name is the Huang Ting. It can turn thoughts, lock delusions, give birth to wisdom and summon spirits. When it is still, the primordial spirit will appear. When it is moved, the true intention will be received and received. Wang Ding had the temperament of an old pedant. His words were very detailed and vague, but his theoretical level was solid. Lu Xiaoyi had heard and read these words countless times in the dome, but he was still focused and did not become absent-minded just because he was tired of listening to it. Daoist Wang Ding was very satisfied with such an attitude under his silent observation. Only then did he start to talk about the real things. Everyone was different. Lu Xiaoyi and Yin Yi were friends despite the difference in age, but he was not. Cultivators were very clear about this. Since he wanted to ask for guidance and was a disciple of Wei Jian Mountain, he would not hide anything. However, there was a difference in how he taught. If you don't have the slightest bit of patience, you will naturally teach without thinking. If you don't understand, go back and think about it yourself. If your attitude is proper and you have a heart that seeks the Tao, then it will be a different kind of teaching method. Teaching and educating people also depends on the target. This nonsense was Daoist Wang Ding's way of judging whether a disciple could be taught or not. It was simple and effective. The heavens have 33 layers, and the core has 3 colors. Golden light illuminates the world, purple qi enshrouds the world, colorless and infinite. That's what the inheritance says, and theoretically, it's also incomparably correct. But what I want to tell you is that when it comes to actually implementing it, it's useless. There were countless descriptions of Jin Dan in the cultivation world. Although they sounded convincing, in reality, there were countless accidents during the core formation stage. It was simply not a controllable process. It's not something that you can decide by swallowing some miraculous pills, meeting some coincidences, and accumulating countless resources. What core formation? From the moment you enter the Tao, in your long foundation establishment career, you have already formed your own path step by step. The direction of your skills, the way you handle things, your own potential, the changes in your state of mind, etc. Many aspects have already determined what kind of core you will form. It's not something that can be formed just by slapping your forehead and saying that this core is good and that core rod is good. Lu Xiaoyi nodded his head. This was something that wasn't written in books, but you couldn't say that what was written in a book was wrong. This was the subtlety of Taoism. So, no matter if it's your Shenyuan, our Wei Jian Mountain, or the Supreme Three Pure Ones, they all have ancient inheritances. They never force their disciples to cultivate in a certain direction. Instead, they focus on free-range cultivation. They would rather bear a large number of disciples who would destroy their own resources in the process of free-range cultivation. They want to cultivate a group of disciples who have truly found their own direction, because only this group of people are the true seeds of Jin Dan. This is a very complicated process. Other than yourself, no one can help you. Your specialties, your hobbies, your potential, your temperament, your nature. When you have sorted out these things and persevered for hundreds of years, then you will naturally have a great path to Jin Dan. Then you can supplement it with some other methods, resources, opportunities, epiphanies, pills, external objects. These are all supplements, but they are not the decisive power. If you don't walk the right path, you won't be able to eat anything. Then, do you feel that you have always been walking your own path and have never given up? Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while, then nodded his head firmly. I believe that I have never changed. Wang Ding laughed loudly. At least, this little guy had no problem with confidence. Meat, come. Wine, come. Junior brother Yin Yi, your meat can't keep up. Yin Yi was a little depressed. Could it be that he, the great Jin Dan, had now become an errand boy? Wang Ding took a mouthful of meat and wine, and was in the mood to chat. Dividing pills into 3 grades is actually a general concept. Every orthodoxy is different. Don't look at how everyone is in the 5th ring now. 20,000 years ago, they all had their own star domains. For example, our Weijian mountain is in the new Guangqing domain, Shenyuan is in the Azure Sky Great World, Supreme is in the new Ding domain, Garin is in the transmission upper domain. Therefore, the division of pills into different grades is also different. Some are divided into 9 transformations, some are divided into 3 grades, some are divided into 5 elements, some are divided into 7 colors, and so on. It's a mess. How can there be a conclusion? The biggest taboo in forming one's core is to divide one's own grade. If you feel that you have a chance to achieve a high grade, you will start acting rashly. If you feel that it's not ideal, you will not be satisfied. If you are so worried about personal gains and losses, how can you have a normal mentality? If you can't even have a proper mentality when forming your core, how can you form your core? Therefore, let nature take its course. When the conditions are right, success will come naturally. Your 100 years of cultivation will determine what kind of core you form. As for whether it's good or bad, why think so much? If the grade is too high, the heavens might not like it and strike you with lightning. Just think about it and live a few 100 more years. That's enough. As for the future, take it one step at a time. Do you think that I'm too negative in advising people to form their core like this? Lu Xiaoyi said seriously, Martial uncle, I understand what you mean. I won't force it. Don't want to become the highest grade of 5-ring Jin Dan in this generation just because you took first place at Fish Leap Sword Insertion. There's actually no relationship between the two. Wang Ding was very gratified. You're worth teaching. That's what I mean. How can there be first place in the cultivation world? Even with your current combat ability, you might not be first. Let me tell you, don't think that the heavenly Tao is usually invisible and untouchable. It actually has eyes. Are you willing to stand at the highest point and be scrutinized by the heavenly Tao, or hide in the crowd and bide your time? Deep emotions don't last long, wisdom changes the heavens, invincibility is hard to advance. Cultivation is about balance. It's just that the balance in everyone's eyes is different. What's mine might not be yours. You can only figure out these things yourself. No one can help you. Throughout the entire discussion, Wang Ding did not touch on any specific methods of forming one's core. This was something that only responsible elders would do. How could there be an identical method of forming one's core in this world? Chapter 488. P.S. Recently, the discussion section has been a little heated. Regarding the choice of inserting the sword, Sloth has to say that it is completely unnecessary. Sloth doesn't want to impose anything on you, so please don't impose anything on Sloth, okay? Leaving the group, watching pirated versions, voting next door, etc. This is not how adults express themselves. Let me remind you that there are people who set the pace. Whether you leave or stay, as long as it is your choice, it doesn't matter. But if you are taken away by others, it will be too sad. The cultivation world is very dirty, and so are other places. You have to keep your eyes open. In addition, please subscribe to my collection. Although my writing is average, I am thick-skinned. I hope that my friends who like it can support me. My days are not easy. Some of my friends are unhappy and have left. Will there be new people coming in? By the way, Sloth will not change his writing style. He is old, but he is unrepentant. No choice. Lu Xiaoyi stayed at Yin Yi's place. It was very interesting to listen to them talk about the cultivation world. Yin Yi still focused his attention on the subordinate planets around the 5th ring. He was a person who yearned to live in the void of the universe, but he couldn't go because of his realm, so he focused on these subordinate planets. In fact, what he pursued was whether there were any opportunities for him to fight wantonly on these subordinate planets. Wei Zhenshan was a little depressed in Erhai. It was okay for him to build his foundation, as he had a chance to test his skills and wouldn't cause any trouble. But the competition between Jin Dan needed to be careful. If he didn't fight, he would feel aggrieved. If he fought, he had to consider whether it would bring any trouble to the sect. The 3 pure ones were here. This was a hurdle that couldn't be avoided. It was also impossible to do things based on one's mood. The stage of the real people was in the void of the universe. In the 5th ring, the Jin Dan was the pillar and couldn't be messed around. Wang Ding was speechless towards this junior brother. Go to the subordinate planets to fight. Only you can think of that. How many people could such a small celestial body contain? And most of them are barren dead stars. With our realm, we can't survive there. Over the past 20,000 years, a total of 100 subordinate stars had been captured. Most of them were the so-called dead stars without an atmosphere, so naturally, there was no spiritium to speak of. There were only 20 or so celestial bodies with a gas layer, but most of them had environments that were not suitable for human habitation. They were abruptly hot and cold, and the temperature difference between high and low was extremely great. There were less than 10 planets with an atmosphere that was suitable for human survival. Only 3 of them had spiritium, and they were all at the level of beginner cultivation spiritium. Such a situation was actually in line with the reality of the countless planets in the universe. Cultivation starfields were hard to find, and high-grade starfields were even harder to find. The result of 20,000 years of exploration was a detailed representation of the stars in the universe. There were also minerals, but they were not precious. If they were placed in the 5th ring, they would be worth mining, but if they were placed in the subordinate planets, they would be worthless. Just the transportation costs alone would be unbearable, so there was basically no need to talk about developing them. Among all the subordinate planets, not a single one was inhabited by humans. But on most of the subordinate planets with a gas layer, there were indeed living creatures, but they were all at the beginner stage of living creatures. There was no spiritium, so of course, there were no big monsters. This was a common phenomenon in the universe. Yinyi was very regretful. With the 5-ring alliance's strategy, the subordinate planets were not distributed to the various powers under the alliance, so there would be less conflict. If you ask me, they should be distributed and let us Jindan level people practice on them. Anyway, it wouldn't hurt to destroy those places. And train the body. Senior brother, I haven't really fought with anyone in 30 years. What's the use of learning sword skills? Wang Ding snorted. Junior brother, I have to say, you're too narrow-minded. How can you only focus on fighting all day? Protecting the 5th ring, maintaining peace in Erhai, the development of the sword vein, and the cultivation of disciples are what you really need to focus on. Lu Xiaoyi sat with the 2 Jindan for another day. Seeing that the 2 of them were still chatting happily, he knew that this gathering would not end in a few days. He was worried about the sword array, so he bid farewell to the 2 elders. Yinyi was very careful. Wei Sword Mountain is your home. Don't treat me as an outsider. You can use the sword talisman to get the same treatment as others, but this is not your home. Don't come to my place in the future. Every time I see you, I'll be at a disadvantage. Lu Xiaoyi had already understood the story of the sheep, so he smiled and said, No, this is also my home. Next time, I'll bring the sheep over. Martial uncle, I have a small matter that I need your help with. Yinyi was very vigilant. Say it. But don't talk about the matter of using spirit stones. Your martial uncle is also very poor now. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. I don't want to use spirit stones. Martial uncle, look at my current situation. I really want to find a quiet place, so it's not good for me to be involved too much. In a few days, Lan Chong and the others will come back. At that time, I can't avoid a period of eating and stuffing. See if you can think of a way to hide me, including the people at the dome. If they know that I'm here, they'll definitely arrest me and interrogate me thoroughly. It's really troublesome. Yinyi shook his head. You're not a young lady, why are you afraid of meeting people? These troubles are also part of cultivation. Deal with them yourself. I can't help you. Wang Ding, who was behind him, opened his mouth and said, Wait a minute. I have a small item here that can cover you up a little. However, you shouldn't touch it casually. There's no perfect way to cover something like this. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi leave, Yinyi was very puzzled. Senior martial brother? Wang Ding sighed. Metal is the complete nature, Dan is the circle of life. The union of life and death is called Jin Dan. This child already has signs of forming his gold core, but it's hard to say whether he can walk out of it in the end. He should have a quiet environment. Yinyi was a little lacking in this aspect. He had a personality that liked to raise his sword and slash people. His grasp of his disciples' cultivation state was not as deep as Wang Ding's. But he still thought that it was a little hasty. The state that Wang Ding mentioned about cultivators could be achieved by many outstanding foundation establishment disciples. This meant that the cultivator had more or less met the basic requirements to form his gold core, but it was hard to say how to take the final step. It could be right now, or it could be decades or centuries later. There was no fixed number. Most people would choose to travel to relax their state of mind and be more sensitive to the will of the heavens. There were also people who sought breakthroughs in dangerous battles. Of course, there were also people who went into seclusion. There was no definite conclusion. You could do whatever you felt was suitable. In short, it was fine as long as it suited your heart. This disciple was different from others. He had too much karma on his body. If he really went out to travel, it was hard to say whether he could come back. But a swordsman could not be afraid because of this. If he didn't go out because he was afraid of danger, he wouldn't have a future. That was why Yinyi rejected him. He was afraid that as a swordsman, he would lose the sharpness of a swordsman. No matter how dangerous it was, he couldn't hide and avoid it. But senior martial brother Wang Ding supported him. It seemed that he saw something that Yinyi didn't. In terms of nurturing disciples to form their gold core, he was too far behind senior martial brother. But he could do something in other aspects. For example, he could communicate with the domed Chenxiu Peak. After thinking for a while, he recorded a message with his divine sense, Shenyuan cigarette butt, Weijian Mountains Fei Chai, in order to avoid any accidents along the way, has arrived at Weijian Mountain recently. It's the eve of forming his gold core. He has requested to cultivate in peace and be indifferent to the outside world. Weijian Mountain has agreed. I hereby notify you. There were 3 layers of meaning in these words. First, he was in Weijian Mountain and was safe. Second, because he didn't want to provoke possible revenge along the way, he chose the closer Weijian Mountain. This was to give face to Shenyuan. Yinyi also felt that the relationship between this disciple and Shenyuan was a bit strange. Although he was happy to see this happen, this was a red line that he couldn't touch. Third, Weijian Mountain had already agreed to his request. In other words, your Chenxiu Peak's sword Qi rushing heaven pavilion shouldn't casually interfere. This message, he still needed to get the approval of the higher-ups. It wasn't something that he could decide on his own. Of course, he also knew that this was just a formality. How serious could the problem of a foundation establishment cultivator be? Chapter 489. What Wang Ding prepared for Lu Xiaoyi was a straw hat. The straw hat could block the detection of divine sense. It was an honorable way of concealing oneself. It was very common in the cultivation world because there were too many situations where cultivators did not want their whereabouts to be exposed. Therefore, the meaning of wearing it was, "Please do not disturb." This was better than complete concealment. At least it showed selflessness instead of being sneaky. It was easier to accept. Lu Xiaoyi wore it and went to the Wei Sword Mountain's martial arts collection. He picked a few sword formations for himself. Of course, he could not hide it from the records of the disciples on duty. Cultivators were tactful. Considering his current situation and his current attire, the disciples on duty would not spread the news. They were all smart people. He only picked 2 sword formations, the yin-yang spectroscopic sword and the Sanyuan sword aura. These were the basics. He could learn the difference between an odd-number sword formation and an even-number sword formation. As for the sword formations with 4 to 6 flying swords in the future, there was no need for them. It was the basic ability of a cultivator to draw inferences about other sword formations from 1 to 10,000. Otherwise, He would be exhausted to death if he learned the heavenly cycle sword formation in the future. When he returned to his residence, he gathered the little ones, Big Marrow, Second Marrow, Third Marrow, all the way to Marrow Chi. Every sword spirit had to learn the sword formation. In theory, even if they did not learn it, Lu Xiaoyi could use his spiritual energy to control them. However, this would be very tiring. This was also the reason why the sword formation could not be popularized to the foundation establishment stage. If the sword spirits mastered the operating mechanism of the sword formation, coupled with Lu Xiaoyi's spiritual energy, the power that could be exerted would not be as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. Every sword spirit had to learn it because Lu Xiaoyi did not know which flying swords would be used to form the defensive sword formation in battle. Of course, he would focus on the attack first. When facing different opponents, which flying swords to use to attack, this was the first thing to consider. Secondly, the remaining flying swords to form the sword formation. However, after a little understanding of the yin-yang spectroscopic sword, he realized that the swordsman did not have a purely defensive sword formation. In terms of the yin-yang spectroscopic sword, there were thousands of changes in it. More than half of it taught people how to attack. This was a pleasant surprise. Because a very important method of attacking a sword formation was to gather the power of all the flying swords in the sword formation and add it to a single flying sword to carry out a focused attack. This was tantamount to giving him another way to increase the power of his flying sword. After going around in circles, he had returned to his original intention. This was the swordsman's skill. The attack had already seeped into his bones. The 7 flying swords flew out together, forming a sword formation in the sky. This was only one aspect. This was the cultivation method of an ordinary cultivator, but he was different. In Bolang Slope, under his command, 4 Seasons and Zhu Cheng led their little brothers to form a sword formation and surf. This was another way to speed up the growth of a sword spirit. With the help of other sword spirits, the weaker sword spirits would grow faster. Lu Xiaoyi was very particular about the combination of sword spirits. He tried his best to pair sword spirits with similar strength. If he used the strongest 4 Seasons to help the weakest navy, it would be meaningless. If he rushed too quickly, it would hurt the navy. Therefore, 4 Seasons with Hidden Fragrance, Zhu Cheng with Big Dipper, and the weakest, Wu Shun with the navy. This combination was not fixed, and after a few days of practice, it would be broken up again. In any case, they were all spectroscopic, so there was no need to worry about them mixing it up. Luck Cutter was more special. Its strength was only related to the strength of the luck in his sea of consciousness. It was useless to surf in Bolang Slope. At this time, Lu Xiaoyi discovered that his so-called Big Dipper 7 Stars formation seemed to be lacking a sword spirit. Because his Wu Shun was a parasitic sword spirit, it did not have a flying sword. He could only leave it for the future. This kind of day was indeed very dull, but after 10 years of competition, it was rare to have such a period of rest. Cultivation, 1 tension and 1 relaxation, this was the right way. Dome, 1000 Elegance Peak. The Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion's Jindan Hall Masters were having another monthly meeting. All kinds of troublesome matters, like running accounts, made people sleepy. There were also many messy matters, but to them, who had long been used to it, it really did not arouse any interest. There were precedents, so they just had to follow them. But there was a topic that everyone knew, but no one was willing to mention it because it was too embarrassing. But things that should be discussed could not be avoided. After the other small troubles were dealt with, no one left, as if waiting for someone to speak first. The atmosphere was a bit strange. Mingchuan Hall was the counterpart hall in charge of education among the tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators on 1000 Elegance Peak. So others could pretend to be deaf and dumb, but Ancient Mountain could not. Slowly, there is another small matter. Since no one is willing to speak, this old man will throw a brick to attract jade. A few days ago, there was news from Weijian Mountain. My Shenyuan Weijian disciple, Cigarette Butt, had stayed in Weijian Mountain to prepare to break through to the next realm. Well, this was not a big deal. With the relationship between the 3 sects of the Sword Alliance, it was normal for him to break through to the next realm. We went to Weijian Mountain's firmament sword sect. They came to Shenyuan not only to build their foundation, but also Jindan. As far as I know, there is one here. Haha, but this cigarette but is a bit different. What is different, everyone knows, so I won't say more. Then, this matter will be ignored, just like the other cultivators in history? Or will my rushing heaven pavilion issue a decree to bring him back? I still need everyone to decide on the cause and effect. Although Jiyu Shan didn't explicitly state his position, the meaning behind his words was very clear. Among the halls of Thousand Elegance Peak, the Ascension Hall, the Inscription Hall, and the Dark Hall were all staunchly protective of their disciples. The other halls were also wearing the same pants as them, completely different from the other faction of Soaring Heaven Pavilion. This was also the strange thing about external swords. Sure enough, once Ancient Mountain spoke, Ancient Forest immediately jumped out. Agreed. Sword vein, sword vein. Isn't it the same no matter where he forms his core? Cigarette but was born in Shenyuan and will always be a person of Shenyuan. This will not change no matter where he goes. What is there to discuss? Could it be that if he forms his core in Weijian Mountain, he will become a person of Weijian Mountain? Then if he forms his core in the wild, he will become a loose cultivator. Will he become a peacock when his peacock feather forms his core? The various hall masters laughed impudently. They were the true masters of the foundation building disciples and had a lot of contact with them. They also looked down on those in Rushing Heaven Pavilion who put on false pretenses. Either you wholeheartedly cultivated and did not care about anything, or you truly went down to the ground level to share trials and tribulations with the foundation building disciples. They were so high up in the air, yet they still came out to point fingers and talk about the sect's righteousness. These people were all old Jindan. They did not have any ties and were not afraid of offending people. However, among the true upper echelons of Shenyuan, they valued this group of people's generosity very much. Therefore, they laughed impudently. Jiyu Dong's face turned ashen. How could he not understand that these words were directed at them? These bastards did not have the slightest awareness of the big picture. He could not let the situation get out of control. He had to stand up. Therefore, he slammed the table. Others can, but this cigarette but is different. He has too many secrets on him. It's not good for him to form his core outside, especially under that bastard Yin Yi. After a long time, he and his secrets will become a person of Weijian Mountain sooner or later. Jiyu Gang suddenly stood up and slammed the table as well, but his voice was even louder. The matter of cigarette butt, the masters have already come to a conclusion. Why is senior martial brother Jiyu Dong still looking into it endlessly? Who doesn't have some secrets? Cigarette but would rather cultivate in Weijian Mountain than return to the dome. It's all because of you bunch of people who have nothing better to do. Even now, you don't realize it and push all the blame to your disciples. You never think about how you are a master. Chapter 490. Jiyu Gang was very angry. Since he had already spoken, he did not mind being impudent for once. As a teacher, you're always thinking about the good things of your disciples. Is this kind of sect still Shenyuan? You want to know everything. You want to know about the spirit of the flying sword. You want to know about the changes in the peacock plume. You also want to know why you were able to insert a sword into the fish-leaping cliff for 10 years. Everything is for the sake of the sect. If you're like you, who can't tolerate special talents, those earth-shattering old ancestors of Shenyuan would not be able to grow. The sect would have already dissected their souls and bones and studied them thoroughly. Is there any meaning? What's his is his. If he gave it to you and gave it to other cultivators, they wouldn't be able to become cigarette butts. It's such a simple logic. You're still in the Rising Heaven Pavilion, but you're so obsessed with it. Jiyu Dong was furious. Jiyu Gang, don't you dare slander me here. You're bringing official matters into private matters. I didn't say what to do with him. He's just a foundation establishment senior brother, not a father. What, do I have to serve him? I can't even ask him. I want to know the secret of the sword spirit's birth. I want to help the external swords get rid of their useless status. What? Is there anything wrong with that? I want to know what happened in the peacock plume. Only then can we reconcile our relationship with the peacock palace. This is the rule set by the old ancestor. It has been upheld for tens of thousands of years. What? Even the old ancestor's rule is not good anymore? I want to know everything he did in the fish leaping cliff. How did he do it? It's also to improve the overall strength of the external sword lineage. Is this for me? There's nothing wrong with trusting a disciple, but if you don't even care about the rules, that's dereliction of duty. My rising heaven pavilion will never allow it. Jiyu Lin said sarcastically at the side. Oh, senior brother Jiyu Dong is so righteous. What a good way to pull the banner. However, it's not your turn to be the head of the rising heaven pavilion. If you really become the head, everyone will break up sooner or later. Everyone has their own secret. The moon gathering once again entered the usual quarrel mode. Only when a dignified divine sense pressed down did everyone settle down under the might of a perfected person. I will communicate with Weijian Mountain about this matter. We have to take care of all aspects. You don't have to participate. I will say one more thing. The next time you quarrel, remember to get lost and quarrel outside. You have no self-restraint. Where do you think this is? Since Junren Yuanying had taken responsibility for this matter, the Jindan under him could do nothing about it. This was a characteristic of all bureaucratic systems. There had to be disagreements and factions at the grassroots level. Only then would the higher-ups be able to control the overall situation. The various halls did not have many opportunities to contact the Junren, but it was much more convenient for the Jindan who cultivated in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. Although he was not clear about the Junren's attitude, Jiyu Dong still found an excuse to privately ask for the higher-ups' opinions. Junren Rui was also very depressed. He was a newcomer who had been transferred to the Rising Heaven Pavilion in recent years. The newcomer did not refer to Yuanying's cultivation, but to his experience in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. This perfected person had lived in the universe for a long time and was a very powerful cultivator. However, he was not familiar with these affairs. This was also the usual practice of Shenyuan. The lower halls were all old cultivators with limited potential. However, in the Thunder Hall and the Rising Heaven Pavilion, the real powerhouses took turns to be the head. The management of affairs was also a part of cultivation. They would not focus on it, but they had to understand it. Only then could they have a sense of the overall situation of Shenyuan. This was also to cultivate the vision of a great cultivator. Facing Jiyu Dong's question, the perfected person also had a headache. I have carefully investigated this person's past and found many strange things. It's not a matter of loyalty, but mainly a matter of cultivation. Regarding the cultivation of the sword spirit, the abnormality of the peacock plume, the creation of the fish leaping cliff. To be honest, this person's appearance has given my external sword sect a chance to turn things around for the first time in tens of thousands of years. If he can continue to grow, the rise of the external sword sect will be just around the corner. Such a person, if placed in other sects, would be the object of the sect's full protection. Resources would be given to him, and he would receive the meticulous guidance of a master. All kinds of escorts and escorts. Although I, Shenyuan, disdain these things, in fact, these things have to be done. After all, talents are hard to come by. However, this cigarette butts experience is strange. In the dome, the support of the inner sword sect is stronger than the support of the external sword sect. What is the reason for this? Was he trying to push away the talents? So much so that when he formed his gold core, in order to avoid trouble, he would rather stay in the Weijian Mountain and cultivate in seclusion. Shenyuan swordsman, in his own sect, actually did not feel any care, but instead felt that it was troublesome. Just based on this point alone, your actions are incompetent. Jiyu Dong was very embarrassed. This perfected master had a fair temperament. In fact, this was the most common opinion among the external cultivators. He needed to explain, otherwise, the perfected master's opinions would have a great impact on the Jindan working in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. Martial uncle, This disciple's level is not high enough, so I don't know the details. However, I heard that this person's special treatment came from the palace master of the Rising Heaven Pavilion, perfected Lord Gong Yarrow. Perfected Master Rui was startled. That's a good excuse. Pavilion Master Gong Yarrow left the fifth ring 100 years ago and never returned. Where can I go to find proof? Who told you about this? It can't be Pavilion Master Gong Yarrow who told you this personally, right? Ji Yudong blushed with shame. No, it's Martial Uncle Lu who told me. Several other colleagues were also present. Perfected Master Rui was even more speechless. Junior brother Lu? He seemed to have also gone out to have fun 80 years ago, right? I heard that he went on a punitive expedition to an unruly star field. Ji Yudong, can you tell me who's at home right now? Ji Yudong was also in a difficult position. Martial Uncle, there's no one else. That's why there's Cigarette Butt's name in the 1,000 Talents Red Book and all the things that happened after. Perfected Master Rui shook his head. Too irresponsible. Too careless. That includes Pavilion Master Gong Yarrow, Junior Brother Lu, and all of you. Ji Yudong stood solemnly and received the lecture. This perfected Master Rui was not an ordinary Yuanying. He was one of the strongest perfected swords of 1,000 Talents Peak. In the future, he was very likely to go one step further and take over the Rising Heaven Pavilion's authority. His words could not be careless. Perfected Master Rui pondered. Special treatment. Perhaps Pavilion Master Gong Yarrow saw something at that time. This could be a bad thing, but it could also be a good thing. Pavilion Master's words were vague, so there's no way to verify it now. However, there's no need to ask what kind of situation it is. Just look at the inner sword's attitude and you'll know. The inner sword has always been supporting him. I heard that he even opened the fan Lu to him. What does this mean? On one hand, he supports him, on the other hand, he spread rumors about the reincarnation of a sword pill. In my opinion, it's nonsense. This is to drive a wedge between this disciple and the outer sword. Even if he has great achievements in the future, he will still be close to the inner sword and alienate the outer sword. As an outer sword, his heart is with the inner sword. Isn't this laughable? More importantly, the inner sword scheme actually succeeded with the help of a group of idiots like you. In the years that I wasn't at 1,000 Talents Peak, has 1,000 Talents Peak lost their minds? Ji Yudong was drenched in cold sweat. He was just a little old-fashioned, but he wasn't really selfish. Previously, he was schemed against by Wei Sword Mountain's Yin Yi. Now, he realized that he had been played by the inner sword's group of bastards. Chapter 491. Martial Uncle, what do you think about us? Reverend Rui waved his hand. It's fine. It's just an initial inclination, and it's far from having any result. I believe that this disciple is still loyal to my Chenqiu Peak. It's just a misunderstanding. The key is the future. Don't push too hard, don't rush to change, and don't ask about his well-being in every possible way. If the change is too sudden, he won't be able to adapt to it. Don't restore his identity as the eldest martial brother, he doesn't need it now. Don't rush to call him back, just ask him what he needs during the process of breaking through and send it to him. Also, remove his red name, it's easy for people who don't know to misunderstand, just like you guys before. Help him naturally, without leaving any traces. His achievements in the Fish Leap realm are not only the pride of my external sword, but also the pride of the whole Shenyuan. He deserves all of this. Hehe, this brat is really scheming. Since the beginning of the 5 rings ranking list, there had been 5 successful cultivators before him. Even if he succeeded, he would only be the 6th, so it wasn't that shocking. However, he could have succeeded, but he purposely lost to a chi practitioner in the end. This indifference was different. He doesn't want to be famous, but instead, he wants to achieve greater fame, and he doesn't want to be tainted by karma. What a good scheme. Go with the flow and don't force him. As long as you don't lose your mind, this disciple will always be a member of the external sword Chenqiu Peak. No matter how insidious his inner sword is, it won't change this fact. Reincarnation? The present world is the present world, it has nothing to do with the past or the future. Above the dome, because of the appearance of a wise and rational reverend who was wary of the inner sword, Lu Xiaoyi's situation began to turn normal. However, he didn't know about this. He lived very well in the Weijian mountain and was very casual. However, as time went by, he began to have sporadic visitors. Even though he was wearing a straw hat, the fact that he was cultivating in this residence was enough to prove his identity to a certain extent. His current state of cultivation was still not a complete state of seclusion. He still liked to stroll around and seek some peace and quiet. Among the 5-ringed foundation establishment cultivators, his name had already spread far and wide. Although he wasn't the 6th person to complete the feat of inserting the sword into the ground, he was the first to abandon it after obtaining it. Cultivators liked this kind of talk. They thought that it was very lofty, that it was very temperamental, and that it was the true meaning of seeking the Tao. Little did they know that it was just a way for him to protect himself. It was very unscrupulous. Such a persona was very attractive. The Wei Sword Mountain was a straightforward orthodoxy. If you did not receive them, you would easily offend them. The reception was too cumbersome and he was not willing to seal himself in a specific area for so-called seclusion. There was a lot of trouble when one was famous, especially in his current state. It could be said that all 5 rings knew him. Now that he had shown his true face in front of tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators, where could he find peace and quiet? Even if he found a city or a town, he might not be able to avoid the troubles of the mortal world. On this day, a few more swordsmen from the Wei Sword Mountain came together. They wanted to see what a flying sword with a sword spirit was. This was an uncontrollable desire. For swordsmen, this desire was uncontrollable. However, there was no one in the residence. After asking around, it seemed that there was news from the dome. The person had already left through the teleportation formation. This was a very normal journey. It was somewhat unreasonable to not return to the mountain gate for decades. No one knew where the news came from, but no one doubted it. They could only sigh as they brushed past the strong cultivator. In a secluded place in the mine, 2 cultivators were waiting anxiously. Yinyi was very dissatisfied. "You little brat, you are really troublesome. You are not in seclusion, you are not in seclusion, you are not traveling, and you are still acting like you are ashamed to meet people. I really regret bringing you to the Wei Sword Mountain in the first place. There are so many troubles for no reason. Let me tell you again, that subordinate star is a desolate place with no traces of people. If I forget you, you might stay there for the rest of your life. Don't say that I didn't warn you in advance." Lu Xiaoyi smiled. With martial uncle's connections, you can really get whatever you want in the Wei Sword Mountain. All these years, I have to rely on martial uncle to live so comfortably in the Wei Sword Mountain. In the end, I even escaped like a cicada. Of course, returning to Shenyuan through the teleportation formation was fake. It did not need to be done deliberately. He only needed to reveal a few words occasionally and people would naturally spread the news. For a cultivator close to the core formation realm like him, returning to the sect was the right choice. It would be puzzling if he stayed in the Wei Sword Mountain. However, he had other plans. Ever since he learned about the subordinate star from Daoist Wang Ding, he had some interest in it. After asking around, he found out that it was not a secret, so he knew about most of it. The subordinate star of the 5th ring was not very useful, and it did not belong to a specific force. No one would develop the subordinate star because its value was not high. 10,000 years ago, someone once proposed to migrate to a habitable subordinate star, but it was all talk and no action. Even if it was a mortal, as long as they were not forced to that extent, who would be willing to leave the safety of the 5th ring and go to a small star with limited spiritual opportunity to develop? The most important thing was, if one day the small star did not follow the movement of the 5th ring, would they come back or not? So far, the subordinate star's function was only as a transit station for major cultivators. Because the distance was not far, the transit station's function was not obvious. Moreover, there was nothing to be added there. The only realistic and meaningful way was the messenger tower. In all directions around the 5th ring, the furthest subordinate star had a transmission device installed on it. Firstly, It was used to transmit information to the deep space of the universe. Secondly, it was used as a lighthouse to point the way. This function was not very useful to a perfected cultivator, but it was very useful to a large number of Yuaniing perfected cultivators, especially Yuaniing newbies. This kind of messenger tower was unguarded on a subordinate star without an atmosphere. No Yuaniing perfected cultivator would be willing to guard such a barren place. It was often damaged by cosmic rays, ion winds, and collisions. It was also very troublesome to repair it. It was not a matter of technical ability, but a matter of who was responsible for it. There were also a few subordinate stars with an atmosphere that humans could live on. Therefore, the messenger tower would be guarded by people to prevent damage from wild beasts or other natural disasters. Because the spiritual vigor was low, it was close to a dead land. Therefore, there were no cultivators who were willing to come here. Only the strong sects would choose old foundation establishment cultivators who were about to die of old age. They would spend their last years alone on the subordinate star in order to obtain large amounts of resources or special protection from their sects. One of the subordinate stars was called the Star of Quicksand. It was a rare star with both an atmosphere and spiritual vigor. However, the entire star was in the form of a desert. It was not a place where humans could live. There was a messenger tower here that belonged to all the forces in the fifth ring. In the past 100 years, it was Wei Sword Mountain's turn to send cultivators to guard the messenger tower. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi had the idea. Because he could be closer to the star here. Chapter 492. Lu Xiaoyi liked the place that others avoided like the plague. Seeing his absent-minded appearance, Yin Yi's head was filled with anger. Combat talent and cultivation talent are two different things. Don't think that just because you're good at fighting, you're also good at cultivation. You only reached the Jindan stage after 100 years. This kind of talent is very common in the fifth ring cultivation world. You're barely in the middle and lower levels. What's there to be proud of? Don't listen to senior brother Wang Ding's words about the state of mind. His words are based on the premise that there are enough resources. What resources can you have on Sand Planet? Spiritual opportunity is not as good as a fifth ring cultivator. There are no pills, no external objects, not even a protector. If you die, no one will collect your corpse. I'm warning you in advance. I won't do such unlucky things. Since you must go there, you'd better dig a hole for yourself. Lu Xiaoyi said softly, I understand, martial uncle. This is not a whim, I'm sure. Yin Yi snorted. He also knew that this person couldn't be persuaded. In fact, almost every cultivator with dreams and aspirations were like this. Once they made up their mind, nothing could change their mind. This was the characteristic of a true cultivator. However, there was really no danger on the Sand Planet. At least in the past 10,000 years, there were only people who died of old age, but no one died of accidents. As a signal tower, the past major cultivators would not stay on the Sand Planet. The only use they had for the Sand Planet was to transmit messages or adjust their course accordingly. However, they would not delay their landing. Yuaniing, how bored would a perfected cultivator be to find trouble with a small foundation establishment cultivator? This was also the reason why the major powers only sent foundation establishment cultivators. Their realm was their best protection. Remember to use the signal tower. It's a waste not to use it. It's the only privilege of the cultivators stationed there. I'm afraid that some people will become crazy if they live alone on Sand Planet. I've already given you the identification beacons of Weijian Mountain and Shenyuan Firmament Sword Sect. If there are any changes, don't pretend to be a wolf. Your glory in Fish Leap is nothing compared to the universe. Don't think that saving you is a troublesome matter. It's nothing more than a few dozen days for a perfected person to cross. It's very easy. I'm willing to bet that the great cultivators left behind at the fifth ring in the sword vein can't wait to take a trip to the universe. Therefore, if you think this way, you're giving them a chance to do so. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. It was nice to have someone caring for him, even though Yin Yi did not know how to truly care for someone. He was pulled into Weijian Mountain by Yin Yi. Even though he did not have a master, Yinyi was playing the role of a master here, teaching a disobedient disciple a lesson. If I order a jug of wine and some food, will the deliverman, oh no, the real people, deliver it to me? Yinyi snorted and said, I will. They'll even bring someone to replace you. Then, I'll bring your corpse back. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. He could understand what Yinyi meant. Yinyi wanted him to not be stubborn when he was in danger and to report first. Then, when he was not willing to stay there, he could just send a message. Wei Sword Mountain could find a replacement for him. Yinyi saw a flying boat in the sky from afar and finally asked, You really don't want to consider finding a companion? It can also relieve your loneliness. Or find a Kuan cultivator to mess around with. If you have such thoughts, just say it. It's not shameful. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Martial uncle, am I that kind of person? If I want to find someone to talk to, why would I go to Sandstar? Wouldn't it be more convenient to stay here? Yinyi was disdainful. What kind of upright person are you? Others might not know about the trivial matters in the Kuan Daoli world, but I'm very well informed. As they spoke, the flying boat was in front of them. A Wei Jian Mountain spiritual master sat on it without raising his head or saying a word. Yinyi signaled with his eyes. Lu Xiaoyi did a proper master's salute and climbed onto the flying boat. When he sat down, he felt himself rising into the sky. When he looked down, Yinyi's figure was only a small black dot. After coming to the fifth ring for 100 years, he didn't expect that the most talkative master was actually a swordsman. The affairs of the world were unpredictable. The flying boat quickly rose into the sky, passed through the atmosphere and rushed into the void. The rhythm was so fast that it was completely different from the medium-sized floating raft that Lu Xiaoyi came on before. However, Lu Xiaoyi didn't show any abnormality. Because now he was no longer the one who just entered the foundation establishment stage. He could be considered as an experienced foundation establishment stage cultivator. Once they exited the atmosphere, it was another lively scene. There were many flying boats, floating rafts, or cultivators who were flying with their physical bodies. Lu Xiaoyi reckoned that if it was not for him, who was a burden, with the character of the Wei Sword Mountain's sword cultivators, they would have used their own physical bodies to cross the atmosphere. So far, Lu Xiaoyi didn't know the name of this spiritual master. If the spiritual master didn't say it, he couldn't ask. Everyone had their own habits and temper. Those with lower abilities could only follow those with higher abilities. This was the reality. The journey wasn't peaceful. Because although this spiritual master didn't talk much, he didn't stop at all. He had only been out for 3 days, but he had already fought with people of all sizes. He didn't understand why he fought with others, or why he fought with others, or why he went to join in the fun when others were fighting fiercely. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. You still have a mission, okay? If something happened to you, how could you leave me, a mere foundation establishment stage cultivator, to wander around the universe? It's too unreliable. Fortunately, although the spiritual master was a little mean, he was indeed powerful. He couldn't be said to be invincible, but at least he didn't suffer losses. He fought and killed along the way. As he got further and further away from the fifth ring, the probability of encountering other cultivators became lower and lower. The frequency of the fights finally slowed down. Only now did he understand that these fights didn't seem to be a life and death battle. They were more like a form of mutual recognition. With his current level, he couldn't understand the techniques of the spiritual masters. He couldn't even distinguish the true meaning of the fights. In his mind, the swordsman of Wei Jian Mountain was very powerful, but he never thought that the person who led him to the Sand Planet might not be the spiritual master of Wei Jian Mountain, but the spiritual master of Rising Heaven Pavilion of Qianqiu Peak. He knew very little about the relationship between the 3 sects of Sword Vein. How could Yinyi have the guts to let an outstanding cultivator like him go to the Sand Planet outside the 5th ring alone? He must be recognized by the Rising Heaven Pavilion. The ignorant Lu Xiaoyi was carried into the deep space. He was different from other foundation establishment stage cultivators who had no sense of direction at all. He had an accurate judgment of his own position, the position of the 5 rings behind him, and the position of the Sand Planet. This was the advantage of studying the star system. Of course, the past experiences of his soul also played a part in this. Cultivators didn't get dizzy from floating rafts and flying boats, but most of them got dizzy from the starry sky. When trillions of stars were coming at them, who knew where they were? Chapter 493. The airship flew for almost a month. In Lu Xiaoyi's opinion, if the perfected master didn't like fighting, they could have been faster. During the whole journey, the two of them didn't speak a word. Lu Xiaoyi could understand that they didn't have anything in common. A perfected master with a bright future and a foundation establishment cultivator who was destined to live on the sand planet, what could they talk about? Among the many planets in the universe that were suitable for living creatures, there was one thing in common: color. The color was basically between blue and green, because living creatures couldn't live without water. However, the sand planet was yellow in color, which was basically synonymous with a desolate planet, even if it had an atmosphere and a certain amount of spiritual energy. In terms of size, the size of the sand planet was a bit like the moon in his previous life. Only such a small size could be captured by the gravitational force of the fifth ring and become one of the satellites of the fifth ring. The atmosphere of the sand planet was very thin, so thin that it seemed like it would collapse at any time. However, the magic of nature was that the sand planet had survived for tens of thousands of years. No matter how thin the atmosphere was, it was still a planet that humans could barely survive on. Of course, this referred to the cultivators, not the large number of mortals. The airship swooped down, passing through the thin atmosphere. Lu Xiaoyi saw 1,000 feet tall sand tower in his line of sight, getting closer and closer. However, the airship didn't land. Instead, it circled a few thousand feet in the air. Then, Lu Xiaoyi felt an irresistible force pushing him out of the airship. The airship shook and passed through the atmosphere again, disappearing without a trace. Was it necessary? Lu Xiaoyi didn't have time to complain, because the first problem he had was how to balance his body. He could fly, but the environment was different, and the flying conditions were different. Simply put, because the sand planet was too small, the gravity here was completely different from that of the fifth ring. He needed to familiarize himself with the specific environment here before falling to the ground. It wasn't difficult. He was just not used to it. It was like a person who lived on Earth being suddenly thrown to the moon. First, he had some understanding of the sand tower. After seeing it for himself, he couldn't help but admire Da Xiu's ability from the bottom of his heart. Originally, he thought that in a planet like Sandstar, which was almost entirely a desert, the materials used to build the sand tower must have been brought in by cultivators from outside. Da Xiu had such ability. But now, it seemed that the construction of the sand tower was simply based on local materials. It was very magical. It was probably due to the basic principles of the 5 elements that he could not understand. Not only would it not be destroyed in the sandstorm, but it was also a self-replenishing process. The sand tower was different from a normal human pagoda. The interior space did not take into account the living habits of humans, so the structure was completely different. There were no obvious layers and no stairs. Basically, it was a huge vertical formation that supported the entire structure of the sand tower. Hanging in the air, looking around, he could already faintly see the arc of the horizon in the distance. This was the characteristic of a small planet. He couldn't go any higher. If he went any higher, he would be out of the gas layer. He didn't have the ability to survive in the void of the universe. The first thing he did when he landed on Sand Planet was to fly around the planet in order to determine its true size. This process took him 5 days. For a foundation establishment cultivator with his pitiful speed, it only took him 5 days to fly around a planet. It was clear that this planet was also very small. What he saw in the 5 days was only yellow sand. The geography of the entire Sandstar, except for the area around the sand tower where soil could be seen because of the highest terrain, was basically covered by desert. This was the only thing on Sandstar. There were creatures, but they were all low-level creatures that were still in the early stages of evolution. If this kind of environment didn't change, perhaps after tens of thousands of years, spiritual beasts would be born, but not now. In Yin-Yi's words, sand star should be a fragment of a huge nebula that collapsed after the explosion. By chance, because it hadn't completely formed its own orbit, it was captured by the passing fifth ring. Another strong feeling was the large temperature difference. This was also a common problem of small stars with thin atmosphere. Because there was not enough thickness of the atmosphere to cushion, the temperature change was not as gentle as that of a normal star. Cultivators could still withstand it, but for mortals, this was hell. But for Lu Xiaoyi, this was actually a good thing. Because of the thin atmosphere, he was closer to the billions of stars in the universe. This was beneficial for his cultivation of the stars. For someone who placed the direction of core formation in the direction of the stars, Sand Star was a more suitable place than the fifth ring. When he came back and stood at the top of the sand tower, he looked around and saw a vast expanse of yellow sand. Occasionally, there would be wind blowing, covering the sky and earth. The entire sky was grey and hazy, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of independence. And this feeling was familiar. It was the feeling he had in the Gobi Desert on his mother planet. It was intimate and distant. He didn't expect that after 100 years of Foundation establishment cultivation, he would return to the starting point of the desert. Was this a coincidence? Overall, this kind of environment was not beyond his expectations. It was within the acceptable range. The sky was grey, the sand was boundless, and the wind blew the dust up, but no sheep could be seen. Lu Xiaoyi completely relaxed here, because this place was most suitable for the two stages of his life that he had the deepest feelings for. One was the loneliness he had developed during countless years of wandering in the universe, and the other was the Gobi Desert where he had just entered the human world to learn and grow. Here, through the thin atmosphere, he had an impulse to penetrate it and then merge with the vast and deep space of the universe. He didn't need to think about anything else. This was the deepest feeling he had since he had transmigrated. There was another kind of feeling. As a native of the mother planet, young Master Sima had a deep attachment to the environment of Pu City. Daily work. It didn't exist. The operation of the sand tower was completely controlled by the internal mechanism of the 5 elements. There was no possibility of it being damaged. As long as the 5 elements existed, it would continue to grow and multiply. Lu Xiaoyi's job was to replenish the formation with spirit stones on time. The spiritual vigor in this place was much worse than in the fifth ring. The formation's speed of gathering spiritual vigor could not keep up with its consumption. This was because the sand tower was constantly emitting its own information waves in all directions in the deep space of the universe, so that the cultivators passing by could determine their specific location. In such a lighthouse-like place, it was actually hard to keep people here. However, if there were people here, they could deal with many unexpected situations. There were also cultivators who proposed to replace it with items with spiritual intelligence. They would be more conscientious in their duties and wouldn't need to be replaced for thousands of years. However, items with spiritual intelligence were hard to come by, and there were countless cultivators in the Foundation establishment realm. It went without saying which method to choose. Lu Xiaoyi finally found a place where he didn't need to worry about being disturbed by others, and where he could come and go as he please. At least at this stage, the sand star belonged to him alone. Chapter 494. To Lu Xiaoyi, cultivating in a place like Sand Star had both advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage was that the spiritual vigor was thin, which was the biggest disadvantage for cultivators at the level of Foundation establishment. They couldn't come into contact with other forms of spiritual vigor other than the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth. The advantage was that he was close to the stars, which could allow his entire cultivation system to be in the best state. For cultivators who had basically met the conditions for core formation, their cultivation had already reached the peak of Foundation establishment. For the time being, they didn't have an urgent need for spiritual vigor. Instead, they had some demands in terms of mental state. In terms of breaking through to the upper realm, this place was suitable. The upper realm of a cultivator was never a process that could be planned, because you couldn't judge when God would open his eyes and give you a chance. Under normal circumstances, When a cultivator's cultivation reached the peak and he had his own comprehension in mental state, he could roughly realize whether he was in the preparation stage for core formation. This stage required many prerequisites. For example, Lu Xiaoyi raised his cultivation to the peak in the 50 years in the peacock plume. Then, he made a deep reflection on his mental state in the fish leaping cliff. Only then did he begin to realize that he had reached this step. What would a cultivator do next? Everyone had their own path to guide them. Thousands of people had thousands of paths, and none of them were alike. However, there was one thing that was the most impossible way to reach core formation if you just sat at home and waited for a pie to fall from the sky. Therefore, most cultivators chose to go out, to see, to travel, to fight, to experience the world of mortals, to experience life and death. The meaning of doing so was to find their own chance. The way of heaven was fair to every cultivator. Everyone would have that chance when they reached this stage. The key was whether they could find it or not. Triggering the resonance of the heart. Then, they would understand their own direction and work hard in this direction to seek a process from quantitative change to qualitative change. Old Man High Toad's Jin Dan song, refining into Qi and returning to Zhenwan, refining Qi into Zichen. The Wuzhen chapter said, Qi was born from nothingness, and Yin and Yang were born from Qi. Daoist Shu's returning to source chapter said, Qi was the fate of the form. There was the Qi of Zhenwan, born before heaven and earth, and obtained from nothingness. It was in a trance, invisible, unseen, unheard, unobtainable. How could it condense into millet pearls? The Saint Gari Sheng used reality to form emptiness, and form to form. The two were like the same thing. The so-called one referred to the condensation of the innate true one Qi into a grain of pearls. The Chittone contract said, branches, stems, flowers, leaves, and fruits hang down. They are the same as their roots, without losing their essence. Wuzhen chapter said, all kinds of non-human labor, like real lead and divine machine. The secret map states, Li Nag is the sun, fire, heart, cinnabar, dragon, and Mercury. Kana Wu is the moon, water, kidney, lead, tiger, and Qi. The Golden Jade Sutra said, inside the cave of the fortune spring, yang energy emanates from the earth, the sundial arrives from the south, the 5 stars align, the sun and the moon combine. The pure yang ancestral master once said, spirit, Qi, and blood belong to the 3 essences, north, south, east, and west. Almost every orthodoxy had its own unique description of Jin Dan. It was precisely because they said too much that people were at a loss for what to do. Among them, the Shizhengjing was the most direct. 3 inches below the navel is the lower dantian, 4 inches in radius, between the spine and the kidneys, green on the left and white on the right, yellow on the top and black on the bottom, and red in the center. It is called the Great Sea, which stores blood and Qi. It is also called the Great Middle, which is the center of the 4 directions of the human body. The central position is the dantian, the golden embryo divine chamber. Cultivators needed resources to form their aurous core, and for most people, this was also their goal. However, people were different. When one's ability reached Lu Xiaoyi's level, he did not need to worry about resources. The sect would automatically release all restrictions for him. It was not giving, but borrowing. There was no limit or quality. If he did not return the dantian after it was formed, no one would pursue it. In fact, it was a form of support. This was the inevitable strategy of every orthodoxy for their disciples. As long as you were outstanding enough, you did not need to sacrifice yourself. In the big sects, as long as you could enter the top hundreds, you would not need to worry about resources. In the small sects, as long as you could squeeze into the ranking, you would receive a lot of resources from the sect. The resources were biased towards the top, and the top would lead the sect after they achieved something. This was a virtuous cycle. Lu Xiaoyi did not lack resources in his storage ring. They were all provided to him by Yin Yi. Lu Xiaoyi did not want to accept them at first, but Yin Yi quickly dispelled his misgivings and told him that these things were provided by Qianxiu Peak, and were part of the reward for his sacrifice. Lu Xiaoyi didn't really want to settle the score with Chen Xiufeng. He wouldn't be able to figure it out, and it would only make him feel distant. He was no longer the same person who had just entered the sect. He wanted to convert every bit of hard work he had put in into spirit stones. He had a high view of things. It was fine as long as he had enough for his own use. How could he really count the value of each fish's head with his fingers? Cultivation was just this strange. When a cultivator did not have any resources, they would place all their hopes on resources. When there were enough resources, they would discover that there were more important things, just like what Daoist Wangding had said. He was not in a hurry, so there was nothing to be anxious about. It was precisely because he wanted to leave more time for himself that he sent himself to this barren desert. He was already close to 150 years old this year. As Yinyi had said, he was not a talented cultivator. Cultivators with 5 rings and above were generally able to form their gold core before they were 100 years old. He was not even close to that. Cultivators with average cultivation talent would form their gold core around 150 years old. As for those with even later cultivation talent, there was no need to mention them. The good news was that his 2 friends, Yang Bo and Yang Cheng, were not much stronger than him. However, he could feel that the 2 of them had already reached his current state decades ago. It was just that they had never found their own opportunity. When they went to Fish Leap to observe the sword, it was not impossible that they did not want to comprehend their own opportunity from other people's battles. At the very most, he still had 50 years. It sounded like a lot, but in fact, it was only the time he would spend in the peacock plume space. For the vast majority of cultivators who had hopes of forming their gold core, they would have several decades of time to either go up or remain silent. Since Lu Xiaoyi had forced himself to this place, he had never thought of changing to another environment. To him, he could never find another place so close to the universe's starry sky, where no one would disturb him, and where he could be free. He really dug a deep sand pit for himself in front of the sand pagoda. The 4 walls of the sand pit were reinforced with simple moisture-proof and insect-proof structures. This way, if he died, he would be able to lie down more comfortably. He did not leave an epitaph because he was afraid that someone would rob his grave. He also did not prepare a pearl in his mouth because he was afraid that he would turn into a zombie after several hundred years. When Lu Xiaoyi did all this, it was as if he was digging a pit for someone else. There was not the slightest ripple in his heart. This was his true nature. He was indifferent to everything. Chapter 495. Lu Xiaoyi's schedule was very regular. In fact, there was no need for him to focus on any particular direction of swordsmanship. His main focus was the strength of the 7 sword spirits. He needed to bridge the gap between them and not think of the 4 seasons or Ju Cheng whenever he fought. This was not beneficial to the diversity of his swordsmanship. Every day, the sword spirits were released to roar between heaven and earth. This was their happiest time. However, this was also the happiest time of their organization and discipline. This was because they were not out for a walk, but to practice their swordsmanship. Lu Xiaoyi did not deliberately pursue anything. This was different from when he first started learning swordsmanship. He did not need to tire himself out like a dog. In his arrangement for himself, the most important thing was that he must set aside a few hours of idle time every day, allowing him to wander around, let his imagination run wild, or look up at the starry sky in a daze. He looked at the stars, counted them, and savored the eternity of time. Correspondingly, the extremely viscous transcendence energy in his dantian slowly flowed through the ripples of starlight. At his current level, the number of stars he could perceive was close to 300. This was also the source of his star power. According to the Big Dipper star scripture, he could actually activate his cultivation technique and enter the core formation state at any time, but he did not do so. Core formation was a technical job. It required a long-term strategy. Xuanyuan's Great Tao cultivation techniques included the Great Tao cultivation techniques of all the sects in the 5 rings. When a cultivator was at a critical juncture, there would be a corresponding secret technique. It was not completely a matter of luck and waiting for the heavenly Tao to open its eyes. For example, the Big Dipper scripture of the star system. When a cultivator's transcendence energy and spirit reached a certain level, and the cultivator felt that his state of mind, transcendence energy, and body were enough to withstand the impact of core formation, then he could activate the secret technique and enter the core formation state. With a large amount of resources, he could charge towards the upper level. The problem was that the secret technique did not guarantee a 100% success rate. In fact, if a cultivator wasn't meticulous enough in other aspects, or if there was a fundamental error in the direction of their core formation, or if there was a flaw in their state of mind, etc., even if they used a secret technique, the chances of success were very slim. This was the reason why most cultivators would fail time and time again at the core formation stage. Secret techniques could advance the process of core formation from a technical standpoint. However, it couldn't influence the direction of the core formation process. What really influenced the success of the core formation process was many other things, some mysterious and unseen reasons. Therefore, the preparations before a cultivator's core formation were not something that could be done on a whim. They needed to spend a very long time to sort out their own cultivation path, ideals, direction, and so on. It was equivalent to looking back on one's own life and finding the thing that was closest to one's heart. Those so-called successful people who had a flash of inspiration had already made preparations in this aspect long ago. They were only waiting for that trace of inspiration in the unseen world. Of course, the Big Dipper scripture also had a secret technique to activate the core formation. Moreover, as a top-notch Great Tao technique, it contained more than one secret technique. It was divided into 3 types: the 7 stars core formation technique, the 4-9 galaxies technique, and the heavenly cycle illumination technique. The 7 stars core formation technique referred to relying on the 7 stars of the Big Dipper to form the core. This was also the most common core formation technique in Taoism. Because ordinary cultivators were limited by their own aptitude and affinity with the stars, they didn't have the opportunity to get close to the stars under the dense and thick atmosphere. Therefore, for many people, it was very realistic to only comprehend a dozen stars in their lifetime. It was very normal for them to choose the 7 stars core formation technique when they finally formed their core. The 4-9 galaxies technique was not something that every cultivator who cultivated the stars could do. It required the cultivator to have an extraordinary talent for the stars and to be able to comprehend the power of more than 49 stars, including the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, within a short 100 years of foundation establishment. As for the heavenly cycle illumination technique, it required the cultivator to comprehend more than 365 stars. When they formed their core, it was as if they were bathing in the real Milky Way. It was a true high-grade technique, but also a freak technique, because basically no one had the ability to do this. What was the difference between secret techniques that used different stars to form their core? It wasn't in power. Instead, it was in the future cultivation technique's depth and success rate. The more stars the secret technique used during the core formation, the higher the margin for error, and the easier it was to achieve the Jindan. However, how could it be easy to perceive more stars? For a cultivator of the star system, it was a contradiction between perceiving more stars to increase the success rate during the core formation, or studying the 7 stars of the Big Dipper in exchange for more time to break through. Lu Xiaoyi's path could only be the heavenly cycle illumination technique, because his affinity with the stars had already surpassed 7 stars when he was still in the early stages of foundation establishment. When he was in the middle stages of foundation establishment, he had nearly 100 stars. When he was in the great circle of foundation establishment and felt the desire to form his core, his comprehension of the stars had already neared 300. There was no reason for him not to use so much of his comprehension of the stars to increase his success rate during the core formation. Therefore, he had come here, where the atmosphere was thin, in order to complete the core formation as soon as possible. 50 years, at least 1 star a year. The time frame was still considered relaxed. Lu Xiaoyi hoped that this would be a leisurely period of time, and not one where he would be forced to become a dog by the pressure. If the burden was too heavy, it would cause a psychological imbalance, and the gains would not make up for the losses. He did not do anything strange. He did not carefully examine the desert on this planet inch by inch, nor did he dig a well to try to find something. His behavior was exactly the same as that of every old cultivator who had been sent here. He guarded the sand tower and passed day after day in boredom. In fact, He had no interest in the sand planet itself. He also did not think that this planet would have anything special left for him after 10,000 years of cultivators staying here. His attention was not on this. Instead, it was on a certain area in the void where the tall spire of the message pagoda pointed. His star system was different from normal star system. The difference was that his star system was a combination of the stars of the positive and negative worlds. This gave him a powerful fighting strength, and it was impossible for the stars to be blocked by others. There were countless benefits. However, the disadvantage was that when he formed his core, he would not only need the support of the stars of the positive world, but also the stars of the negative world. This was basically impossible for a mere foundation establishment cultivator to do with his own ability. If he wanted to break through the negative world, he would need a powerful foreign floating raft, at least the cultivation strength of a Yuaniing expert. Moreover, he was not sure how to do it. When the floating raft jumped between the two worlds, how would he distribute the proportion of the stars he sensed? Time. How much? If he needed a day to form his core, would he have to let others ride the floating raft and go back and forth between the two worlds for a day? Would he start from the positive world and then go to the negative world? Or would he stay in the jumping state and feel the stars of the two worlds at the same time? Would it be easy to maintain this state? There were too many uncertainties. He did not have the heart to find others to help him. Whether it was the Daoist masters of the Thousand Virtues Peak or Weijian Mountain, or the mysterious sacred weapon in the Peacock Palace. When a cultivator needed someone to help him form his core, he would fall into a disadvantage. Chapter 496. Then, how could a mere foundation establishment cultivator come into contact with the antimatter space that even a perfected master couldn't understand? Couldn't he ask for help? The only way he could think of was through the signal tower. The signal tower on the subordinate star. The signal tower on the solitary sand planet didn't have such a function in other directions. The function of the signal tower was to guide the cultivators. It allowed the cultivators to accurately determine their position in the vast void. But there were some cultivators who needed the signal tower's guidance even more. Those were the floating rafts flying in the antimatter space. If they wanted to return to the fifth ring at the correct point in space, they could only rely on the signal tower to guide them. In other words, if there was an antimatter floating raft in the fifth ring that wanted to jump out, it could only appear in the space near the solitary sand planet. Lu Xiaoyi was on the solitary sand planet, so he could observe the process of the space jump at a close distance. In other words, if he formed his core quickly, he could obtain the effects of the stars of the two worlds at the same time during the jump of the floating raft. He knew that this was the key to his core formation. When he obtained the boost of the stars in the opposite space, he didn't understand anything. He only knew that there were benefits, but he didn't know that every benefit in the cultivation world came with a price. The Three Pure Ones cultivators used their sect's most powerful dimensional reducing spiritual tool to isolate the senses of the stars, but it couldn't do anything to him. This also meant that he would have to pay the price for his abnormal combat ability in the future. The Big Dipper scripture that Lu Xiaoyi learned was an incomplete prerequisite cultivation method. He also believed that when he reached the Yuaniing True Monarch realm in the future, a top-grade cultivation method like the Big Dipper scripture would definitely mention the problem of the compensation of the stars in the antimatter space, and it would be solved in his cultivation and upper realm. The problem was that his steps were too fast, and he was straining his balls. He had obtained something that only the Yuaniing class could come into contact with until now, but he couldn't do the method that the Yuaniing cultivators used to solve this problem. Without a practical secret technique, even if he could obtain the second half of the Big Dipper scripture, how could a mere foundation establishment cultivator like him do something that only perfected masters and true monarchs could use? Lu Xiaoyi could only think of a way himself. As a result, he came to Sand Star and gazed at the starry sky by the message tower every day. That was not to be silent and foolish, but to experience what he could gain every time a floating raft returned from the negative world and a short transition passage opened. This was not something that could be solved by the appearance of a floating raft. Lu Xiaoyi was calculating the approximate frequency of the floating raft's appearance. The length of time each time he came out. What does time have to do with anything? Was it the size of the floating raft? Or could it be completely controlled by humans? Wait a minute, these things required him to observe and record day after day to form data, and then extract what he really needed from them. It was rare even for a fifth-ring bandit to rob someone through the antimatter space. After 10 years of observation, Lu Xiaoyi realized that it was far less frequent than he had imagined. There were occasional deviations, but basically, it maintained the rhythm of a floating raft returning every 2 to 3 months. He had been here for 10 years, but the total number of times he had seen the floating raft return from breaking through the wall was no more than 53. Through these 53 observations, he realized that to him, there was far more bad news than good news. The most terrible thing was that the time it took for a single raft to jump from the negative world to the main world was very short. From the moment he felt the energy fluctuations in the space, Lu Xiaoyi focused all his attention on that space. From the time the space opened, the floating raft split open, to the time the floating raft completely entered the main world, and the transition passage began to close, the entire process did not take more than 10 breaths. Large and medium-sized floating rafts took 100 breaths. Some powerful individuals' powerful assault rafts could pass through the transition passage in the shortest time of 10 breaths. It was truly incomparably fast. Lu Xiaoyi could understand that the shorter the time, the safer it was for the cultivator on the raft, and the less chance of being ambushed by the enemy. But to him, the space passage was so short, and the time was calculated in breaths. How could it be used as a window to break through to the core formation realm? Plans and reality were often filled with endless contradictions. The things that Lu Xiaoyi calculated in his plans were actually worthless when he actually brought them to the actual situation. The only possible opportunity was the fleet. In the 3rd year after Lu Xiaoyi arrived at the Sand Planet, he encountered such a fleet. Dozens of large and medium-sized floating rafts lined up to pass through, and the entire process lasted for no less than an hour. This was the best opportunity he had ever seen. He could sense the power of the stars in the negative world the entire time. However, he could never be sure whether the next one to appear would be a small floating raft or a large one, or a fleet. This made him unable to make any preparations in advance. It could be solved. Lu Xiaoyi secretly comforted himself. There was always something that he had not thought of. Maybe it could solve all his problems. While he was paying attention to the starry sky, he was also carefully observing the sand tower's array. He did not want to understand it. With his level of insight, even if he looked at it for 10,000 years, he would not be able to understand the mechanism of the array. However, if he wanted to see something on the surface, it would be enough. For example, if there was a floating raft approaching from the antimatter world, appearing, breaking through the wall, and leaving, would there be any changes in the signal tower during this series of events? What was the difference between the signal strength and the degree of interference? He was just looking at the surface and deducing some substantial things from it. After 10 years, Lu Xiaoyi had accurately grasped the series of changes in the signal tower when the floating raft approached in the antimatter world. According to his judgment, the signal tower's signal would provide more frequent location information when the floating raft approached, allowing the array on the floating raft to constantly self-locate. At this time, with his ability to judge the signal strength and energy, he could roughly predict the arrival of the floating raft 2 days in advance. The success rate was above 90%. When the signal tower's signal began to become chaotic, it meant that the floating raft was close to breaking through the wall and leaving. This time was only a few moments. In other words, when the signal tower's signal began to be disrupted, the floating raft would inevitably appear. The success rate of this judgment was 100%. There had never been a mistake. What he was afraid of was the word serious. With Lu Xiaoyi's soul from his previous life, the antimatter world, which was generally understood by those who were at least at the level of true monarch, was just the tip of the iceberg in front of him. He could now, to a certain extent, solve the problem of the floating raft's appearance. This was very important. It meant that he could carry out some basic preparations before forming his Azoth core in advance, and fix the time window to the moment the transition channel opened. For example, if he predicted the arrival of the floating raft, he could form his Azoth core a day in advance. He would start with the main world stars. After reaching a certain level, he would wait for the transition channel to open. He would then quickly use the channel to deal with the stars in the antimatter world to assist his Jin Dan. Chapter 497. P.S. Adding an update for the friends who pulled out their swords and left. Although you guys left me, I still remember the help you guys gave me. Happy studying. But there was still a problem that had not been solved. The transition channel was too short. This seemed to be an unsolvable problem. He had no experience in core formation. The star pill was a rare exception in the Shenyuan sword school. There were only a few cases, and the occasional cases were all 7-star pill condensation pills. It did not mean much to him, so he had no idea how long the transition channel needed to be open during the core formation process to ensure that he could make full use of the stars in the antimaterial world. Although he was not clear, he was afraid that the short time of 10 breaths was not enough. He could not control the thoughts of Zhenren and Supreme Immortals. This was a fatal flaw. But Lu Xiaoyi was not a person who gave up easily. He still had a glimmer of hope, and that was the arrival of a large fleet. 7 years ago, a large fleet appeared, but Lu Xiaoyi was not ready at that time. He hoped that in the next few decades, he would be lucky again. The fifth ring was a den of bandits. It should not be rare for a group to go out and rob, right? Time passed slowly in Lu Xiaoyi's careful plan. When a person lived alone on a dead planet, time always passed slowly. But he had a lot of things to do, so he felt that time was not passing slowly enough. Another 20 years passed in a flash. It had been 30 years since he first landed on Sand Planet. During this time, he successfully increased the number of stars he could perceive to more than 365. This was the result of the star perception in the main world. In the antimaterial world, there was no need to perceive so many. Every skill had a primary and secondary. Since he lived in the main world, of course, he would focus on this place. In theory, he already had the basic conditions to activate the heavenly cycle illumination technique and enter the core formation stage. But he was still waiting. He was waiting for the last and most important piece of the puzzle in the core formation process. It was he who forced himself to this point. If he did not discover the secret of the antimaterial world when he returned to the fifth ring through the antimaterial world, if he did not have the 50 years of experience in the antimaterial world in the peacock plume space, without these, he would only be an ordinary cultivator pursuing the upper realm. The secret technique of the Big Dipper Sutra was enough for him. Of course, if not for this, he would not have been able to suppress all the heroes at Fish Leaping Cliff. In the Great Tao, you had to pay the price for what you gained. There was nothing that didn't come with a price. During this period of time, he had a more thorough understanding of the appearance of floating rafts from the antimatter world. Through the changes in the signal tower and the intensity of the signal disturbance, he was able to accurately determine the size and number of floating rafts in the antimatter space of this airspace. According to his deduction, 3 or 4 floating rafts were not enough time to pass through the passage. What he needed was a large fleet with dozens of floating rafts. Only then would he have enough time to complete his core formation. He believed that there would be one, so he had been waiting. In the process, he even tampered with the signal tower. Of course, it was not a change. He did not have the ability to do so, nor did he have the knowledge to do so. He did not even dare to change any of the lines, for fear that he would accidentally destroy the beacon tower and ruin his plans. His change was very simple, and it was within the scope of his authority. It was to lower the energy level of the array. Simply put, the array of the signal tower was powered by supreme-grade spirit stones. Every supreme-grade spirit stone would be replaced with a brand new spirit stone when more than half of its spiritual energy was depleted. This was the rule, one of the few rules that the guardian of the signal tower had to abide by. However, Lu Xiaoyi purposely mixed in some supreme-grade spirit stones that were more than half depleted. The purpose was to test the influence of the strength of the energy supply on the signal tower. He had made such preparations over the past few decades. He did not know what it was like for others to form their core, but his was full of risks, coincidences, luck, and gambling. Will I have luck? Observing the lifeless cloud of fate in his mind, Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. He had swallowed a lot of other people's fate, but he was still in a half-dead state. This cheat was really useless. However, something as high and mighty as fate was not something that a mere foundation establishment like him could come into contact with, right? Perhaps the future would be better. Time passed slowly as he waited. He had already prepared so much, and he did not want to change anything. Besides, he could not think of any other Jindan that he could achieve. The celestial core was the most suitable for him, and it was also the core that he had been immersed in for more than 100 years. It was said that a cultivator could not go all the way, and could not be stubborn. However, when you were really in the middle of it, you would find that you really had no choice. In the antimaterial world, a long fleet of interstellar rafts was moving quickly. There were more than 20 rafts in the fleet, and a very special thing was that the rafts were made in various shapes. At first glance, it was obvious that they did not come from the same star field. Among them, there were 5 black rafts that obviously came from the same star field. On the heads of these black rafts, there was a prominent symbol of the 5 rings, indicating their terrifying origin. Among the 5 black rafts, some were in the front, some were at the back, and some were patrolling on the flanks. Looking at their flying positions, it was easy to guess what the situation of the other 20 rafts were. They were the spoils of war brought back from this large-scale expedition of the 5 rings. In the history of the 5 rings, such forced plundering was common, and it happened almost every year. Some were the actions of individual cultivators, some were the actions of a certain force, and some were the actions of an alliance. Judging from the scale of this team, it was an alliance. It was a joint operation of the bandits of the 5th ring, big and small. Of course, it was not hard to predict that their opponents would not be ordinary small cultivation realms, but rather the strong cultivation forces of the big cultivation realms. Although there were not many such forces, they could always be encountered in the 5 rings world. It happened once every few hundred years, and it had never failed. The bandits returned with a full harvest, and in fact, they were not too worried about encountering any accidents. In the antimaterial world, except for a certain sacred place that could not be spoken of, the other spaces were basically desolate, and there were no human cultivators living there. Although the rafts were made in different shapes, the ones controlling the rafts were all 5 rings cultivators. This was also the principle of the bandits. Other than precious goods, they only robbed foundation establishment cultivators. They did not even want Jindan cultivators, let alone perfected Yuanian cultivators who had completed their great Tao. The 5 rings robbed people to supplement their own foundation, and to diversify their base, not to lack perfected cultivators and perfected immortals. In one of the mid-sized rafts in the outer space, there were piles of space storage devices piled up messily. There were also dozens of dispirited foundation establishment cultivators sitting there silently. The long journey had made them tired, and if they were in a bad mood, it would be a terrible trip. Chapter 498. P.S. I'm very sorry. When you joined the League, Sloth didn't pay attention, so he added the update late. I wanted to add one more update for you, but a poor man's ambition is short-lived. I really didn't have much stock left, so Sloth decided to be a thief. Thank you for your support, thank you very much. In addition, during the double update period, I would like to ask for everyone's help. Vote for me every month to earn some face. Secluded Ocean sat among the foundation establishment cultivators. He was as listless as the other cultivators. These people, including the other foundation establishment cultivators on the floating rafts, were all from the same domain. They were all low-level cultivators from a high-grade cultivation domain, the Sun-Top domain. The Sun-Top domain was very famous in the nearby universes. It was an existence that dominated several universes. It had a long history and produced many talented people. With hundreds of thousands of years of cultivation history, the Sun-Top domain cultivators had no opponents in their own universe that could compete with them. Until the bandits passed by. The Fifth Ring sect didn't come directly to the Sun-Top domain. Instead, they passed by the Sun-Top domain very far away. However, ever since the bandits heard about the wealth of the Sun-Top domain, they were very interested in going to pay their respects. At first, it was the joint effort of the Temple Lord and another large sect. In the end, they didn't return. They didn't manage to snatch anything, and most of the cultivators died at the Sun-Top domain. This wasn't much. The bandits were unbridled in the universe. In fact, it was inevitable that they would suffer losses. This was because they didn't gather their strength and underestimated their opponents. However, they didn't get wiped out many times. Hence, when the Temple Lord was wiped out this time, the Fifth Ring sect was very excited, because they finally met an opponent that they could fight to their heart's content. Next, it was the internal conscription of the Alliance. The Supreme Three Pure Ones and other Law Vein's main forces, Sword Vein fighters, Body Vein meat shields, and so on were very enthusiastic. The bandits had their own rules. How the spoils were divided depended on the effort. Next was the expedition. Of course, the strength of the bandits was only 20% to 30% of the Fifth Ring sect's strength. They invaded like fire and crushed everything along the way. After more than 10 years of fighting, they finally defeated the Sun-Top domain and returned with a full load. Their group of rafts was only the first wave of the expedition against the bandits. There were still many more to come. Collecting the spoils of war was also a very time-consuming task. The spoils of war did not only include goods, but also people. However, unlike the time when they had plundered Lu Xiaoyi, the Lu Xiaoyi had no sense of honor back then, but this batch of Foundation establishment cultivators did. This was because they had history, inheritance, and pride. Therefore, they had a sense of honor. They were both at the Foundation establishment stage, but assimilating them was much more difficult than assimilating Lu Xiaoyi and the others. However, the people at the Fifth Ring did not care about this. They believed that the charm of the Fifth Ring was enough to dilute everything with time. In the eyes of the real Grand Cultivators, it was actually not important how many of the building foundation stage cultivators they captured from the outside world could truly become useful. What was important was that these newcomers could bring the bloodline and luck that originally belonged to their mother planet. That was the most important thing. The heavenly Tao could not always favor the Fifth Ring. There would come a day when the providence of the other realms would come. The strategy of the Fifth Ring was that no matter who had providence, this place was the melting pot of all realms. There were people everywhere, so the Fifth Ring naturally had a share of providence. Senior brother Yu Hai, we've been flying for almost 3 years. Are we almost there? A brother beside him could not bear the loneliness and asked. These people did not come from the same sect or orthodoxy. They came from different sects and clans on the Sun Peak. After spending a long time together and empathizing with each other, they were very close. This was also why the people at the Fifth Ring were cunning. They would not allow the Foundation establishment cultivators from the same sect to gather together, so they were scattered on different floating rafts. This was also a kind of deep understanding of human nature. When they put a few fellow disciples together, it would be easy for them to gather together and encourage each other. They would also strengthen each other's meaningless ideals, such as how to take revenge after they succeeded. Yu Hai sighed. Since we're here, let's take things as they come. Junior brother, you don't have to worry too much. People like us who have just formed our Tao Foundation can cultivate anywhere. From a personal point of view, there's no difference. The other cultivator beside him did not like what he heard. Senior brother Yu Hai, what are you saying? It's only been 3 years. Have you forgotten all those grudges? The deaths of the patriarchs of the Three Sons sect, the losses of the sect, and the loss of resources, can you just ignore them? Can you recognize a thief as your father? This cultivator's words were approved by most of the Foundation establishment cultivators. Yu Hai did not dare to talk back. If he did not do well, he might get beaten up. Even a Fifth Ring sage would not care. Why bother? He closed his eyes slightly and focused his mind, distancing himself from the chaos around him and the righteous indignation. Revenge should be kept in the heart, not just in the mouth. He did not know if there were others on this floating raft who had the same mission as him, and he did not care. To him, it was enough to do what he should do. His goal was very simple. It was to locate the fifth ring. The location of the fifth ring was not a secret in the universe. How could they hide their tracks in such a huge star region? However, it was difficult to approach the fifth ring from the main world. The distance was long, and there was no way to get close secretly. For a domain as powerful as the fifth ring, it was difficult to achieve the effect of a thunderous attack. What they needed to do was to locate the fifth ring in the antimatter space. This was to achieve the effect of a surprise attack. As for when they would counterattack the fifth ring, a small Foundation establishment cultivator like Yuhai had no way of knowing. He probably did not have an exact timetable either. They needed to unite different star regions, be strong enough, and have suffered greatly from the fifth ring. This kind of alliance in the universe could not be solved with just a sentence or a piece of information. It would require at least hundreds of years, or even thousands of years of careful preparation, and he was just a small nail in this plan. He was just doing a good job of locating the fifth ring's antimatter space in the early stages. He might not be the only one doing this, or it might be just Yang Ding. There might be many forces hiding behind him. Then, he would have to wait. Hundreds of years, or even thousands of years, waiting for the day when it all began. And he might not be able to see that day come. But it did not matter. For the peace of the universe's cultivation world, he was willing to do anything. Even if one's status was low, could one ignore the order of the cultivation world just because one's status was low? The floating raft he was on was a very special floating raft. It was made with a secret technique by Yang Ding. Under its ordinary appearance, it had a very special function. It could automatically send the signal characteristics here to the floating raft hidden in the antimatter space at Yang Ding when the raft passed through the transition channel. It could also simultaneously decipher the location information sent out by the fifth ring's signal tower. He was the one who controlled it. This was an honorable mission. Because it used an extremely secretive, mysterious power transmission, he might have a chance to survive. It all depended on his luck. As for luck, he never lacked it. This was because of the existence of the ball of luck in his mind. In the Yang Ding domain, people with luck like him were not a secret. They were known to the higher-ups in a small circle. This mission was related to the mysterious ball of luck in his mind. Furthermore, in order to strengthen his luck, the sect had specially selected a few fellow disciples with the same luck for him to absorb. This was because he was a newcomer who had just formed his Tao foundation. The fifth ring bandits only took newcomers, not the old. Thinking about how his fellow disciples had no hesitation when they offered their luck, and how they faced death with no hesitation, he felt a wave of sadness. Nothing could stop him from completing his mission. Even if he had to pay with his life, he would not hesitate. Chapter 499. How long had he been here? Lu Xiaoyi didn't dare to calculate. It should be almost 50 years, right? He was now 200 years old. If he were to be placed in a sect, those who had yet to form their gold core at his age could only do odd jobs like Jiyu Bei in the Hall of Duties at the foot of Thousand Grace Peak, or go to the mortal world to blossom and bear fruit. Outstanding combat talent and trash cultivation talent were the characteristics of Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation. In these 50 years, he had contacted Yin Yi a few times and rejected his request to go back. The only thing he was curious about was why Yin Yi didn't have any other reaction to his rejection. Theoretically speaking, it was very easy for a core formation stage cultivator with real power to take back a disobedient little foundation establishment stage cultivator. All he had to do was to inform a certain perfected cultivator. For a nascent soul stage cultivator to take him away was no more difficult than taking away a chicken. However, Yin Yi didn't respond after asking a few times. This made Lu Xiaoyi feel very strange. This wasn't Yin Yi's style. Fortunately, no matter what the reason was, he was lucky that he wasn't harassed here. It wasn't easy. His current situation was that everything was ready, and he only lacked the east wind. His cultivation had long been polished to the peak. His spirit was abundant, and his mind was clear. More than 400 stars were vivid in his mind. There were countless times when there was a demonic voice in his heart, telling him to form his core. You will definitely succeed. However, he still resisted this impulse. Although there was no precedent to follow, based on a cultivator's intuition, he knew that if he didn't form his core in the antimaterial world, he would definitely fail. This feeling was so strong that he couldn't ignore it. He had waited for almost 50 years, but there was still no fleet from the antimaterial world. If it was someone else, they would definitely think, what if there was no fleet in the next few decades? Could it be that he would just stop like this and not try to form his core again, or change to another method? However, Lu Xiaoyi was still unwavering. This was not only a kind of persistence, but also a kind of judgment. The basis of this judgment came from the ball of luck in his mind. It was still as lifeless as it had been for 100 years. If something bad were to happen, then there would definitely be a change in this group of luck. Since there was no change, it meant that his current luck didn't change. There was still a chance. This reverse inference was the driving force behind his persistence. Cultivation required accurate judgment, persistent confidence, and patient waiting, even if this kind of waiting was somewhat awkward, and Lu Xiaoyi was about to die from waiting. One day, Lu Xiaoyi, who was concentrating with his eyes closed, sensed a familiar signal fluctuation. This was the sign of an antimatter floating raft approaching, and he was very familiar with this. He was still meticulously looking for a pattern in the response of the signal. This had already become his homework every time the floating raft appeared on Sandstar. After 50 years of identification, he could already find some kind of substantial pattern in the seemingly chaotic responses. This was not a clear insight into the mechanism, but purely the appearance of facts obtained through countless experiences. 1 or 2, the signal tower's signal was far more chaotic than that of a single raft. Lu Xiaoyi knew that this was most likely a small raft fleet. He had experienced this situation far too many times. In fact, when the raiders returned from the depths of the universe, the most common thing was a small raft fleet with less than 5 floating rafts, followed by a single raft, and at the very least, a large fleet. As he continued to identify, his expression gradually became serious. This was not a small raft fleet made up of several floating rafts. From the signal tower's increasingly chaotic responses, he could determine that this was a fleet. He couldn't count how many there were, but there were at least 20 of them, because every single floating raft was sending out positioning information to the signal tower, and every single one was also receiving information. Amidst all this chaos, it meant a great opportunity for Lu Xiaoyi. Should he continue to wait? What if it was a large fleet of 100 floating rafts that passed through? Lu Xiaoyi's judgment was very clear. There was no window of time for 100 floating rafts to pass through. Even if there was, the large fleet would not pass through all at once. They would also use the current method of 20 or 30 rafts passing through in groups. In other words, this current situation was the best opportunity he could wait for. There would not be any greater luck. After waiting for 50 years, the wheel of fate finally began to turn. Lu Xiaoyi discovered that he was very calm. What was there to be excited about? He came alone, and at worst, he would leave alone again. He had friends who were sad for him, and he also had his own legend left in this bandit's continent. What was there to be dissatisfied about? His movements were swift, and similar scenes had been demonstrated thousands of times in his mind. He quickly replaced the half-full top-grade spirit stones that he had accumulated over the years with the spirit stones that were full of spiritual power in the signal tower's array. The purpose of doing this was to not affect the signal function of the signal tower, but to effectively reduce the signal strength. He had experimented many times. When the signal of the signal tower weakened, the space transition channel would appear closer to the signal tower and to the sand planet. This was a very normal linkage compensation between the antimatter space floating raft and the signal tower, and he, because the space transition channel was closer, he would be able to sense the anti-world star on the other side of the channel more effectively. Since he did not have the ability to fly into the universe and take the initiative to contact the space transition channel, at the very least, he could make this thing closer to him within the scope of his ability. In order to succeed in forming his Azoth core, he had almost used his planning ability to the extreme. He still had more than 2 days' time. The fleet was still some distance away from the breakthrough point. He hoped that this group of guys would fly faster and not dawdle in front of the space transition channel like some people. He once again went through the process that he could consider in his mind, and there was nothing that he missed out on. He sat cross-legged on the ground with his 5 hearts facing the sky. The storage rings were neatly worn on his fingers. On average, there were 2 rings on each finger, and there were also some on his toes for convenient access. He did not lack resources, and he had prepared enough top-grade spirit stones and spirit jade. The sequence of the Big Dipper star scripture had long been memorized in his heart. The reflections of nearly 400 stars had always been in his body, forming a huge star chart. The 7 sword spirits were unusually quiet. They could also feel something, so they no longer used their magic power and divine soul sword chi to knock on the door. Instead, they held hands in a circle, waiting for their master to break through. Their fate was the same as their master's. Lu Xiaoyi was a little regretful. He should have taught them to sing a song. This situation was a little funny. He wanted to tell them that there was actually no need to be so serious. Just do what you need to do. Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, Master and the 7 little sword spirits, a man and, I'm hopeless. At this critical moment, I'm still thinking about these completely irrelevant things. His dantian moved, and the heavenly cycle illumination secret technique was activated. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.